Welcome to the Sea Wolf, a werewolf fated mate romance, where fate is messy, the sparks are wild, and the full moon brings more than fur and fangs. There is snark, steam, and a mate bond neither of them asked for, but cannot escape. Buckle up, ack. From haunted hearts to ancient curses, you will find stories here that pull you in and do not let go. If you are into tales that twist the real and the unreal, you are in the right place. TM and Nyxen Audiobooks. To my subscribers and listeners, your ears give these stories their second life. Hit that subscribe button and let us dive in. The storm came in off the open water a little after midnight, and Dane was already on the cliffs when it arrived. He could not have said why. That was the trouble with an alpha's instincts. They never explain themselves. They simply rose somewhere beneath the ribs, like a hand pressing flat against the inside of his chest, and they pushed. Tonight they had pushed him out of a warm bed, past the sentry fires, past the last of the wind-bent pines, all the way to the black edge of Tradewinds territory, where the land ended in 100-foot fall of wet stone, and the sea began in white violence below. His wolf had been pacing under his skin for 3 days, restless, listening for something that had not made a sound yet. So Dane stood in the rain in his human shape, because the cold helped him think, and he watched the storm tear the ocean apart. It was a brutal one. The kind the old wolves called a widowmaker, waves stacking on waves, the wind ripping the tops off the swells and flinging them sideways like handfuls of gravel. Lightning walked to the horizon in long white strides. Every fishing family on this coast knew better than to be out in it. Every boat in the harbor had been hauled and lashed since sundown. There was nothing alive out there. That was what he told himself, in the last quiet moment of his old life. And then he saw her, a pale shape in a trough between two breakers, there and gone, so fast that any other man would have called it foam, or moonlight, or his own tired eyes. But Dane was not any other man. His eyes had been built for darkness by 100 generations of hunters, and they did not lie to him. There was a woman in the water. No boat. He swept the swells once, twice, dragging his gaze across every ridge of black water. No hull, no wreckage, no orange smear of a life vest, no flare. Nothing but her, a white arm rising out of a wave, Aguisebs reaching for the lightning. And then the sea folded over her, and she was gone. His wolf hit the front of his mind so hard it staggered him. Go. There was a path down the cliff face, if you were generous with the word path. Seam in the rock, slick as oiled glass, that the pack's young ones dared each other to climb in fair weather, and got the hiding of their lives for it, afterward. Dane took it at a dead run in the dark, in the rain, and some cold, distant part of his mind informed him that this was how alphas died, and the rest of him did not care even slightly. The sea met him at the bottom like a fight. It had been waiting all night to start. He shifted as he hit the shallows. There was no decision in it. One stride, so was a man, and the next, the change tore through him, bones flowing, senses exploding wide, and a wolf the color of storm cloud and slate drove into the surf where a man had been. The cold bit through his fur like teeth. It found the skin beneath, the muscle beneath that, and it squeezed, and his body screamed at him in the oldest language there was. Land animal, you do not belong here. He swam anyway. The first breaker buried him. The world went black and white at once. Black water, white roar, and the salt scoured his throat raw when the sea forced its way into him. He came up coughing, lunging over the back of the wave, and caught one glimpse of her in the lightning flash. Closer now, hair fanned across the surface, face turned up to the rain like a drowned saint. Then she went under again. And this time, she did not come back up. Dane filled his lungs and dove, and the world stopped. That was the thing no one ever told you about the sea at night, the silence of it. Above the surface, the storm was a living thing, all howl and crash and thunder. Beneath was nothing, a hush so total it rang in his ears. The cold pressed against his eardrums. The dark pressed against his eyes. He swam down through a black so complete it had texture, and the only sounds in all the world were the dull, distant boom of the waves overhead, like a war happening in another country, and the frantic drum of his own heart. He should not have been able to find her. He knew that, even then. The sea at night gives nothing back. But there, below him, deeper than any swimmer had a right to be, a paleness, a glow that was not a glow. Her hair moved around her face like kelp in a slow current, drifting, weightless, malhapsably graceful, as if the water were cradling her on its way to killing her. Her eyes were closed. Her arms floated open at her sides. She was sinking, the way leaves fall, unhurried, almost peaceful. Something about that peace frightened him more than the storm did. Dane drove his body downward, lungs burning, fur dragging at him like a sodden coat, the pressure squeezing his skull, and the distance between them closed by inches, by half inches, while the black water grew colder. Around him, colder than the night, colder than winter, a cold that belonged to the deep places where nothing with warm blood was ever meant to go. His vision started to spark at the edges. His wolf snarled at the dark itself, and his hand, human again, he would shift it without knowing it, the change, rolling through him in the water because he needed fingers more than fangs. His hand closed around her wrist. The storm stopped, not eased, not faded, stopped between one heartbeat and the next, as if the sky were a door and someone had simply closed it. Far above the two of them, the wind died from a scream to nothing. The rain quit in a single breath. The mountainous swells dropped, collapsing into long rolling hills of glassy black, and the thunder swallowed its own voice mid-roll and did not speak again. Dane registered none of it. He was 40 feet down with a dying woman's wrist in his grip and a chest full of fire, and the only thought in his head was up. He kicked for the surface, hauling her against him. Her body was small and shockingly cold and heavier than it should have been. The sea did not want to give her back. He could feel it, an actual drag, a reluctance in the water itself. And then they broke the surface together, and the night air hit his lungs like a blessing and a blade at once. Sea was calm. He noticed it the way you notice furniture in a burning house, a flat fact, filed and forgotten. Water that had been trying to murder the coastline 10 minutes ago now lay as smooth as poured metal under a tearing sky, clouds shredding overhead to reveal the moon. He would think about it later. He would think about it for the rest of his life. But in that moment, he was only a body doing a body's work, arm across her chest, her head lolled back against his shoulder, his legs driving them both toward the pale line of the shore. The shallows took his feet. He stood, staggered, went down to one knee in the surf with her in his arms, caught up again. The sand of the cove was black volcanic grit, hard-packed, and he laid her on it, above the tide line with a gentleness that surprised something in him. She was not breathing. "No," Dane said, to her, to the sea, to whoever was listening. "No, you do not." He would done this before. Every wolf raised on this coast had. Tilt the head, clear the airway. The heel of his palm found the center of her chest, and he pressed. 1, 2, 3, counting under his breath, rain-soaked hair hanging in his eyes, the moonlight pouring down on the two of them through the impossibly clearing sky. Her skin was as white as bone. Her lips were gray. "Come on," he gritted. "Come on." He bent, sealed his mouth over hers, and gave her his breath. Once, twice. Her chest rose with borrowed air and fell again, still and silent. He went back to her breastbone, pressing, counting, and somewhere in the middle of the count, he heard his own voice drop into the low, whirling timbre of an alpha's command, the voice that pack wolves could not disobey, the voice that had no business working on a drowned stranger. "Breathe." The sea behind him drew a long, slow hiss up the sand, and the woman convulsed. She came back to life the way the drowning always do, ugly and violent, her whole body seizing, and Dane rolled her onto her side as the seawater came out of her in a rush. She coughed until the coughing tore at her, hands clawing into the black sand, shoulders heaving. He held her steady through it, one broad hand splayed between her shoulder blades, murmuring the low, wordless sounds he would have used on a hurt pup, on a panicked yearling, on anything wild and suffering. "Easy," he said. "Easy. You are out. You are on land. I have got you." Her coughing broke apart into ragged breathing. For a long moment she simply lay there, curled on her side in the moon-silvered sand, every breath a small victory, and Dane knelt over her in the unnatural calm, and finally, let himself look at her, young. Younger than him, he thought, though something about her made the word feel wrong, the way it felt wrong to call the ocean young. Dark hair, plastered to her face and throat in long ropes. No coat, no boots, barefoot, in the tail end of a widowmaker storm, 10 miles from the nearest harbor. No story explained her. No boat had sunk tonight. No plane had fallen. She had simply been out there, in the heart of the worst sea of the season, as if she would grown from it, and she smelled. Dane went very still. She smelled of brine and cold and deep water, which was no surprise. But underneath it, faint as a memory, was something else. Something his wolf knew before he did, and rose to meet, hackles lifting along his spine, not in threat, in recognition. Wolf, his instincts said. She is a wolf, but no wolf he had ever scented smelled like the bottom of the sea. The woman stirred. Her hand closed slowly in the wet sand, gathering a fistful of it, as if she needed proof of the land, and then her eyes opened, and Dane forgot how to breathe for the second time that night. Sea green, not the green of leaves or summer or any living thing that grew in soil, the green of deep water with the sun striking down through it, lit from within, luminous in the dark of the cove. Eyes that had no business in a human face, looking up at him from beneath wet lashes, with an expression he would spend a long time trying to name. It was not gratitude, it was grief, it was fear. It was an apology. Her lips parted. Her voice, when it came, was wrecked from the salt and the screaming sea, barely more than a whisper, and the words landed in the silence of the becalmed night like stones dropped down a well. You should not have done that. Dane stared at her. Behind him, the sea lay flat and gleaming and silent all the way to the horizon, like something holding its breath. You are welcome, he said slowly. She shook her head, a small, exhausted movement, her cheek dragging against the sand. Her strange, light eyes slid past him, out over the dark water, scanning the horizon the way his sentries scanned the tree line, looking for something, dreading something. You do not understand. Her fingers tightened in the black sand. No one was supposed to find me. No one was supposed to touch me. Her gaze came back to his face, and the moonlight caught in it, and it shimmered like the surface of the sea in a moment before a storm. Now it knows where I am. It, Dane repeated. The hair was standing up along his arms, and not from the cold. What knows where you are? The woman looked at him for a long moment, at his face, at his soaked shoulders, at the cliff rising behind him, with the lights of the Tradewinds packlands glowing faint and warm at its crown. Something in her expression cracked, just slightly, just enough. What is your name? She rasped. Dane. He did not add the rest. Alpha of the Tradewinds wolves. Some animal caution held it back. Yours? She closed her eyes. Above the cove, the last storm clouds were unraveling into ribbons, and the stars were coming out over a sea as flat as a held breath, and not one drop of rain had fallen since the moment his hand had closed around her wrist, though neither of them said so, and only one of them knew why. Brooklyn, she whispered, and for what is worth, I am sorry. Sorry for what? She opened those impossible sea-green eyes and looked past him at the calm, dark, waiting water. For what follows me. The infirmary cabin sat at the heart of the Tradewinds packlands, a long, low building of cedar and stone, with a fire that never went out. Generations of wolves had been born under its roof, stitched up under its roof, and carried out of it feet first when their time came. It smelled of wood smoke and dried yarrow and old, clean linen, the smell to every wolf on this coast, of being looked after. Brooklyn walked into it like a prisoner walking into a cell. Dane noticed that. He noticed everything about her, which was its own kind of problem, but he noticed the way her strange eyes mapped the room the moment they crossed the threshold, the door, the 2 windows, the gap behind the wood stove. Exits. She catalogued the exits of a healer's cabin, the way a soldier catalogued the exits of an ambush. He had carried her up the cliff path wrapped in his own coat. She had not thanked him for that either. Sit her by the fire, said Doc Hale, already rolling his sleeves. He was a broad, gray, unhurried man who had been the pack's healer for 30 years, and he had the bedside manner of a tide chart, neutral, reliable, immune to drama. Half drowned, you said. All the way drowned, Dane said. She came back. Did she now? Hale's eyes flicked over the girl in the firelight, barefoot, salt-crusted, swaying slightly, her dark hair drying into ropes of tangled curl. Lucky girl. Name. A pause. The fire popped. Brooklyn, she said. Brooklyn what? The pause went longer this time, her jaw set, and in the hearthlight, Dane watched her choose, deliberately, to be difficult. Just Brooklyn. Hale glanced at Dane. Dane gave the smallest shake of his head. Leave it. And the old healer shrugged the shrug of a man who had treated stubborn wolves his entire life, had outlived most of them. Fine. Just Brooklyn. Sit. She sat on the edge of the cot like it might be wired to something. The fire threw gold across her face, and for a moment, with her eyes lowered, she could have been any shipwrecked girl in any port town in the world. Small, soaked, exhausted, young. Then a log shifted in the hearth. The light moved, and her eyes lifted, and that illusion died quietly in the corner of the room. Sea green, lit from within, watching everything. Word had traveled, of course. Word always traveled in a pack. By the time they would reach the cabin, half a dozen wolves had appeared out of the night with lanterns and questions, and Dane had sent them all home with a look. But he could feel them out there still, his pack, his people, curiosity pressing in against the cabin walls from the dark like the storm had pressed in from the sea. The Alpha had pulled a stranger out of a widowmaker. A stranger with no boat, no boots, no story. A stranger that his wolf, even now, in the warm, bright safety of the infirmary, could not stop staring at. Through his eyes, wolf, his instincts kept saying, low and certain, the way they said storm coming, blood on the wind. Wolf. And underneath that, quieter, in a register he would never heard from his own instincts before, a single word he refused to look at directly. Not yet. Not tonight. Right. Doc Hale dragged a stool over and sat in front of her, unlooping the stethoscope from his neck. Let us hear that heart, then. You swallowed half my ocean tonight, girl. Lungs like yours should be. He reached for her wrist. It happened fast. Afterward, Dane would replay it 100 times, slowing it down, and even in memory, it was fast. Faster than any shift he would seen in 40 years of pack life, and he had seen warriors change mid-leap. Hale's fingers closed on her wrist, gentle, professional, the same grip he would used on 10,000 patients, and Brooklyn's breath stopped. Her eyes went wide and blind, fixed on something that was not in the room, some other hand, some other place, some old and terrible memory wearing Doc Hale's face, and the panic took her all at once, the way deep water takes you. No thrashing, no scream, just gone, under, instantly, and she shifted. There was no flow to it, no human, into animal unfolding. One heartbeat, there was a girl on the cot, and the next, the cot crashed over backward, and a wolf hit the floor of the infirmary in a low crouch, ears flat, body pressed against the stone wall, and every soul in that room forgot how to move. Because she was wrong. Beautiful, beautiful first. Beautiful before anything else, but wrong, the way deep-sea creatures are wrong, built by rules from a world with different laws. Her fur was silver blue, and it did not behave like fur. It moved in the firelight the way moonlight moves on water, rippling when she breathed, flowing when she trembled, as if every hair on her body were a wave deciding which way to break. Light did not sit on her coat. It traveled through it. Looking at her was like looking down into a midnight sea with the moon on it, and Dane's eyes kept insisting that if he stared long enough, he would see all the way to the bottom. Her eyes were the same sea glass green they had been in her human face, lambent in the dim cabin, twin points of coal. Light over a black muzzle, and her paws. Doc Hale saw them the same moment Dane did, and the old healer, 30 years of breech bursts and crushed legs and battle wounds, a man Dane had never once seen flinch, made a small sound and stepped back into the wall of shelves behind him, rattling every jar on them. Her paws were webbed, broad, long-toed, and between each toe a pale membrane of skin stretched fine as the fin of a fish, translucent at the edges, where the firelight bled through it. Paws made for a medium, wet, wolves did not belong to. Paws out of the oldest stories on this coast, the ones grandmothers told in the storm season, half lullaby and half warning, about wolves who ran beneath the waves. The smell of her rolled across the room, and Dane's hackles rose on a body that was still shaped like a man. Every wolf he had ever scented in his life, packmate, rival, rogue, stranger, carried the same deep notes of everything else: earth, musk, blood, warmth, forest, the smell of the land, because wolves were the land's children, and the land signed its name in all of them. Brooklyn's wolf smelled of brine and cold and depth, stone that had never seen the sun, currents that had never touched a shore. It was a clean smell, and a vast one, and it did not belong inside walls. Standing in that small firelit room, breathing it, Dane had the sudden, dizzying sensation of a trapdoor opening beneath the world he knew, that the ocean off his coast, the ocean his pack had fished and feared and sung about for 300 years, had an inside, an interior country, and something from that country was crouched against his infirmary wall, wearing the shape of a wolf. "Nobody move," Dane said softly. Nobody had been about to. The silver-blue wolf was pressed so hard against the stone that it seemed she meant to pass through it. Her flanks heaved. Her lips were drawn back off her teeth, white even, very sharp, but it was not aggression. He knew terror when he saw it. Her luminous eyes ricocheted from Hale to the door to Dane and back, and her claws scraped restlessly against the floorboards, and outside, the wind began to scream. It came up out of the calm night in seconds, out of nothing, a gale flinging itself against the cabin walls, until the timbers groaned and the fire flattened and guttered in the hearth. Loose shingles chattered overhead. Something unsecure went tumbling and banging away across the yard, and out in the dark, the great pines began to roar like surf. Doc Hale glanced at the rattling window and muttered something about the storm circling back, but Dane was watching the wolf, and the wolf's heaving flanks were keeping time with the gusts. In it, and the wind rose, shrieking under the eaves. Out, and it sagged, moaning away across the cliff tops. Her panic spiked as a jar tipped and smashed somewhere on Hale's shelves, and the whole cabin shuddered under a blow of air like a god's open hand. Panic, gust, terror, gale. It was a rhythm, a coupling, call and answer, and once Dane heard it, he could not unhear it, and the hair stood up along his arms exactly as it had on the beach, in the impossible calm, with her dead wrist in his hand, and the storm switching off around him like a lamp. The sea had not gone quiet tonight, because the storm blew out, he thought, with a cold, clear, falling sensation, like stepping off the cliff path in the dark. The sea went quiet because she did. "Easy," Dane said, not to the room this time, to her. He crouched, slowly, putting himself at her level, below her level, his palms open on his knees. Behind him he heard Hale make a strangled noise of protest. Alpha, her teeth, and Dane ignored him. He let his wolf rise into his eyes, into his voice, not the command voice, not the alpha roar that flattened challengers, the other one, the old one, the voice for pups born in bad winters, for yearlings caught in snare wire, for wild and suffering things. "Easy, Brooklyn. You are on land. Nobody here will put a hand on you again without your say-so. I give you my word, and on this coast, my word is law." He held her eyes, those impossible, glowing, deep-water eyes, and lowered his voice further, beneath the screaming of the wind, so that the words were for her alone. "You came back from drowning once tonight. Come back from this too." For 3 long breaths, nothing. The gale hammered the walls. The fire cowered in its hearth. Then, slowly, the silver-blue wolf stopped trembling. Her flanks gentled. Her ears came up off her skull, one and then the other, and her lips slid back down over her teeth. And outside the wind began to die, not all at once, like on the beach, but gradually, in steps, in breaths, fading from a scream to a moan, to a long, exhausted sigh that combed away through the pine tops and was gone. The fire stood back up in the hearth. The cabin ticked and settled. In the new silence, the wolf flowed back into a girl. This shift was slower, and watching it was like watching the tide retreat, the fur draining away in ripples, the lines of her remaking themselves, until Brooklyn knelt on the floorboards in the firelight, human, again wrapped in Dane's coat, shaking, ashamed, and very small. "I am sorry," she whispered to the floor. "I am sorry. He touched my wrist and I was somewhere else. I am sorry." Nobody answered her, because that was when Dane realized the cabin door was open. Old Mara stood in the doorway with a lantern in her fist, and the dead wind still stirring the gray hairs that had escaped her braid. The pack's midwife, 80 years old, maybe more, nobody asked. The oldest living memory of the Tradewinds, the woman who had caught Dane himself on his birth night, and most of his pack besides. She had seen everything this coast had to offer, twice. She was looking at Brooklyn where you look at a grave that has been opened. How long she had been standing there, Dane did not know. Long enough. Her lantern light trembled, her hand trembled, and her eyes, sunk in their nets of wrinkles, went from the girl to the clawed gouges in the floorboards, to the girl again, and her lips moved around the words before any sound came out of her. "Moons save us," Mara whispered. The stories. The words dropped into the quiet cabin like stones into still water, and Dane felt them ripple through everyone in the room. Doc Hale looked away. Brooklyn wet rigid inside the borrowed coat. Dane stood up, putting himself, without quite deciding to, between the old woman's stare and the girl on the floor. "They are children's tales," he said. Mara dragged her eyes off Brooklyn and looked at her Alpha, at the boy she would pulled into the world with her own two hands, who now stood a head taller than any wolf on the coast, and there was no deference in her face at all. There was something much worse. There was pity. "Then someone forgot to tell her that," Mara said. She turned in the doorway, an old woman with a lantern, and looked out into the dark, past the yard, past the pines, down toward the cliffs and the black and glass calm sea. "And someone," she said quietly, "forgot to tell the sky." By sunrise, every wolf on the coast knew that was the way of a pack. There were no secrets in it, only delays, and the night's delay had run out somewhere between the last watch and the first kettle. The story moved from cabin to cabin with the breakfast smoke. The Alpha had gone into a widowmaker's sea and come out with a woman. The woman had died on the sand and come back. And in the infirmary in front of Doc Hale himself, she had turned into a wolf, out of the grandmother tales, silver as moonlight, eyed like sea glass, with the webs of a seabird between her toes. By the time the sun cleared the pines, the story had grown a tale and was chasing it. She had called the storm. She had killed the storm. She had walked out of the waves on two legs, dry as a bone. She was a blessing. She was a drowned ghost. She was the sea's own daughter, come to collect an old debt, and by mid-morning, the pack hall was full, and Elder Corvin was on his feet. The hall was the oldest building on Tradewinds land, older than the infirmary, older than the harbor, its roof beams, cut from trees that had been seedlings when the pack first came to this coast. 300 years of fires had blackened its rafters. It smelled that morning, the way it always smelled when the whole pack crowded in out of bad weather, wood smoke and wet wool, leather and pine pitch, and underneath it all, the warm animal press of too many bodies, 140 wolves in human shape, packed shoulder to shoulder on the benches and standing 3 deep along the walls. It did not sound the way it usually sounded. A Hathy packet assembly had a rumble to it, talk and laughter and argument, pups getting hushed, old men coughing. This morning, the hall held a different noise, one that Dane had heard only a handful of times in his life, and never liked. A low, unsettled growl hum, half sound and half feeling, rising off the gathered wolves like heat shimmer. Nobody was doing it on purpose. Nobody could have stopped it either. It was the sound a pack made when it could not decide whether it was frightened, and 140 animals were all asking their neighbors the same wordless question. Into the middle of that sound walked Brooklyn. Dane had offered her his arm at the door. She had not taken it. She had squared her shoulders inside a borrowed shirt and borrowed boots, and walked the length of the hall on her own, down the open aisle between the benches, through a silence that spread around her like rings round a dropped stone, and overhead, as she walked, the morning's thin drizzle thickened against the roof shakes until the whole hall could hear it. Rain, on a day the fishermen had sworn would hold fair. Rain that had started though only 2 people in the building knew it, at the exact moment Brooklyn had seen the size of the crowd waiting for her. She came to a stop in the cleared space at the center of the hall, where disputes were heard and judgments given, and stood dripping, her hair, borrowed coat, the hem of it all softly shedding the rainwater she had carried in with her own dread. A puddle gathered slowly at her feet, catching the firelight. She looked very alone in it. Dane, standing at the head of the hall where the Alpha stood, found that he was gripping the rail of the speaking stone hard enough to whiten his knuckles, and made himself stop. Wolves of the Tradewinds. His voice settled the hum the way a hand settles a restless horse. For the moment. You have all heard 6 versions of last night by now. Here is the 7th, and it is mine. So it is the true one. A woman was drowning in the stormy sea. I went in. I brought her out. She is a wolf as we are. She is nothing like we are. The voice came from the elder's bench, and it did not need to be raised to carry. Elder Corvin had been schooling that voice for 70 years. A historian's voice, a teacher's voice, dry and precise and reasonable. The voice that had taught 3 generations of Tradewinds pups their letters and their lineages. He rose from the bench the way old trees lean in the wind, slowly, with a weight that made the whole hall turn. He was a tall man, gone thin with age, white-braided, wrapped in the gray ceremonial cloak of the keeper of histories, and his eyes, pale, intelligent, deeply tired, were fixed not on his Alpha but on the girl in the center of the floor. Look at her, Corvin said gently to the hall. I mean it, all of you. Look at her and listen to the roof. 140 wolves listened to the rain. It rains because she is afraid, Corvin said. It calmed last night because she went quiet. Some of you have heard this already from those who stood in the infirmary, and you have spent the morning telling yourselves it is not possible. He shook his white head slowly. It is possible. The sky has been answering this girl since she washed onto our sand, and it will go on answering her. Every fear, every grief, every fit of temper, for as long as we let her stand on our ground. Boats will go down, answering her bad days. Roofs will come off. The lowland dens will flood. He spread his thin hands, sorrowful, eminently fair. I do not say she means us harm. I say she is harm, the way a fire in a hayloft is harm, whatever the fire intends. The growl hum rose. Heads were nodding along the walls, fishermen mostly, and the families from the flood-prone lowlands. But on the benches near the front, a young mother stood up with a pup on her hip, flushed and furious, and called out that the stranger had been 3 days dead in the water by the look of her, and the Alpha's own breath had brought her back, and since when did the Tradewinds throw the moon's miracles back into the sea? And someone else shouted that miracle was a fine word for a thing that drowned harbors, and then half the hall was talking at once, and the rain came down harder on the roof, and Brooklyn stood in the middle of all of it with her chin up, and her eyes down, and the puddle spreading at her feet. She did not defend herself. Not one word. Dane understood, watching her, that she had heard every line of this argument before, in some other hall, on some other coast, in front of some other fire, that she knew how it ended, that she had walked into a widowmaker sea rather than hear it again, and the sea had refused to keep her, and so here she stood, hearing it again. Something in his chest began, very quietly, to burn. Enough. Corvin's dry voice cut the clamor, and the hall settled, and the old man turned at last to face the speaking stone, and his Alpha behind it, Dane. Son of Marin, son of Hale of the North Cliff, you have led this pack honestly for 11 years, and your father before you, and I have served you both. So hear me as your eldest counselor, not your enemy. He drew a breath, and for the first time that morning, the historian's composure showed a hairline crack. Something underneath it, old and cold, cast her out, today. Kindly, if you like, provision her, escort her down the coast, wish her well, but she cannot bide here, she cannot. Put her out, Alpha, before she brings the deep down on us. The phrase went through the hall, and most of the pack heard only an old man's superstition, a grandmother's curse word for the cold dark under the waves. But Dane was standing close enough to see his counselor's face. And Corvin had not said it the way a man says a figure of speech. He had said it the way a man recites something, eyes fixed on the middle distance, the words worn smooth with handling, in the cadence of a line learned long ago from someone else's mouth. before she brings the deep down on us. A quotation, a rule. The deep, said the way you would name a creditor. Later, much later, Dane would understand what he had heard. That morning he only filed it away, the way he filed the calming sea. A wrong note, the door ajar somewhere in the dark of the pack's long house, because at that moment Brooklyn lifted her head and spoke for the first time. He is right. Her voice was low and salt-roughened, and it stopped the hall cold. She turned, slowly, taking them all in. The benches, the walls, the elders, the young mother with the pup, and the rain on the roof eased as she spoke, softening, as if her own surrender were a kind of calm. Everything he said is true. The sky does answer me. It has been like that since I was a child, and I have never once been able to stop it. People who stand too close to me for too long get hurt. They drown, or they burn, or they freeze, and the ones who live learn to look at me the way half this room is looking at me right now. She said it without self-pity, evenly, like a sailor reporting depths. Your elder is the first person in years to tell the whole truth about me to my face, and I will not repay honesty by arguing with it. Give me the boots and the coat, and I will walk south today. No escort. Nobody has to. The word was out of Dane before any part of his mind had agreed to say it. It came up out of him from somewhere below thought, his wolf surging forward through his chest, through his throat, taking his voice on the way, and what landed in the hall was not the measured ruling of an alpha speaking stone, but something older and harder, a single syllable with hackles on it. The whole pack felt it. 140 wolves went still at once, the particular stillness of a pack when the alpha's animal is suddenly, unmistakably in the room. Dane stood there in the ringing quiet, as surprised as any of them. His wolf had decided. He could feel it standing immovable behind his ribs, facing the entire hall, facing Corvin, facing the rain itself, with its feet planted on either side of the dripping girl in the center of the floor. Mine to guard, said that stance. In the oldest language there was, he had not chosen it. He could no more have unchosen it than unchosen his own heartbeat, and somewhere under the shock of that, in the small remaining corner of his mind, that was still only a man, a memory surfaced. His father's voice, decades gone, telling a boy by a night fire how it had felt the first time he stood near the woman who would be that boy's mother. It is not a feeling, lad. Feelings ask. This does not ask. It had not asked. Dane came around the speaking stone and walked down into the cleared space, into the judgment circle, and took his place at Brooklyn's side, close enough that the puddle at her feet darkened the toes of his boots, and faced his pack. Hear your alpha, he said quietly. The hall was so silent he could hear the fire eating its logs. This woman came to our coast out of the deep water with nothing. No pack, no kin, no roof. The law of the Tradewinds, the law every pup in this room had from Elder Corvin's own mouth, says the stranger at the door is given fire, food, and the pack's protection until the pack itself votes are gone. Not shouted gone, voted, in this hall in daylight, after a full season's acquaintance. That is the law of hospitality as it is written, is it not, keeper? A muscle moved in Corbin's jaw. The historian could not unwrite his own books. It is written so, then it stands so. Brooklyn of the seas, under Alpha's protection from this hour. Dane let his eyes travel to benches, wall to wall, and he let them feel the wolf in his look. Her safety is my honor. An injury to her is a challenge to me. If the sky over our coast frightens you, and it should, it frightens me, then we will learn it together, as a pack learns a new sea before fishing it. We do not throw a drowning woman back into the water because we are afraid of the splash. The young mother with the pup thumped her fist on the bench back, and others took it up, and a ragged sound that was half assent and half release rolled through the warm, smoky air. Not the whole hall. Not nearly the whole hall. Along the west wall the fishermen stood with their arms folded, and their faces shut, and the lowland families looked at the floor, and the pack that filed out of the great doors into the easing drizzle went out as two packs, talking in two camps, under one sky. Corvin was the last of the elders to fly. He paused beside Dane at the speaking stone, an old man wrapped in gray, watching Brooklyn across the hall as the young mother, to Brooklyn's evident terror, introduced her to the pup. "You do not know what she is," Corvin said softly. "Neither do you," said Dane. "That is the problem." And he was watching for it. He could not have said why, but he was watching the old man's face when the words landed, and so he saw it. The flinch. Small instant mastered almost before it began, a tightening around the pale eyes, a fractional drawing back, the look of a man who has been struck precisely on a wound he believed well hidden. "Neither do you," but he did. Dane knew it then, knew it in his blood and his hackles, with no evidence at all, and no possibility of being wrong. Elder Corvin, keeper of the pack's histories, teacher of its pups, the driest and most reasonable voice on the council, knew exactly what Brooklyn was, and had spent a long, long lifetime praying nothing like her would ever wash ashore. The old man inclined his head to his Alpha, correct to the last, and went out of the hall into the rain, which was, Dane noticed, beginning very gently to clear. Dotted Cottage stood at the far southern edge of Tradewinds land, on a grassy shelf above a small stone beach, closer to the water than any other roof the pack owned. It had belonged to a whale watcher once, a strange old she-wolf, dead 20 years now, who had liked the sea more than she liked company, and had built accordingly. One room, deep-silled windows facing the water, a wood stove, a bed, a table, 2 chairs. The pack is used for storage these days. Nobody had slept in it for a generation, because no Tradewinds wolf wanted to sleep that far from the heart fires, that close to the cold hush of the open coast. Dane had thought of it before the pack meeting was even over. He would watch Brooklyn through her first night in the guest den at the heart of the village, or rather, he would watch her not survive it. She had not slept. He knew, because his own sleep had gone thin and useless with her to the same sky, and twice before dawn he would seen her standing outside in the dark, perfectly still, head tilted, like a creature listening for something it could not find. The village was a good half-mile from the cliffs, tucked out of the wind in pines, and the sound that reached it from the sea was faint and broken. The third time, after standing in the cold, he would simply said, "Get your coat." Now he shouldered open the cottage door. It stuck, salt-swollen in its frame, and gave way all at once with a sound like a cork, and stood back to let her pass. Brooklyn stepped over the threshold slowly. Dust, lamplight through dirty glass, sheeted furniture, the smell of cold stone and cedar, and 20 years of quiet. And underneath the floor, under the grass shelf, under everything, constant as a pulse, the boom and drag of the sea on the stones below. He watched the sound reach her, watched it land in her body, her shoulders coming down from around her ears, her breath going long, some pilot light behind her face reigniting. She crossed to the seaward window, put her fingers on the sill, and stood there a moment with her eyes closed. "I can hear it," she said, quietly, like a confession. "That is the idea." Dane set the basket Mara had packed on the table. Bread, smoked fish, tea, a jar of honey, with a scrap of cloth tied over it. "You went 3 days in the village without sleeping. A wolf that does not sleep gets strange, and you arrived strange, so we are in unmapped country," was the closest thing to a joke anyone had aimed at her since she would washed ashore, and it caught her off guard. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not a smile, but it was a place. A smile could someday live. "The pack will not like this," he said. "They're Alpha hauling firewood for the Storm Witch. The pack does not like half of what I do. That is what the speaking stone is for." He knelt at the wood stove, began building the fire, talking over his shoulder, deliberately easy. "You are under my protection. Protection that is all teeth and no firewood is not worth much on this coast in October." So it began. He told himself that first week that he came south every day or two because an Alpha looked after what he would sworn to look after. He brought wood. He brought oil for the lamps, putty for the rattling window, and a proper kettle. He repaired the door so it stopped sticking, and regretted it, obscurely, when it no longer announced him. And Brooklyn watched all this industry from the corner of her one room, with the wary, waiting stillness of a creature that has learned exactly how long kindness lasts, and what is usually expected when it stops. And while he worked, he watched the sky. He had not meant to begin cataloging her. It happened the way tracking happens. The eye gets a pattern in it and cannot stop. Morning he arrived to find her scrubbing the cottage floorboards, with her jaw set and her movements too hard. The wind off the water was sharp and fitful, snapping at the shutters, gusting from no particular quarter. The evening she sat on the doorstep watching the moon rise out of the sea, with her arms around her knees and her face quiet. The night was so still. The smoke from the chimney stood straight up like a plumb line. Wind for the chop and churn of her temper, stillness for her was rare, unguarded calm. And rain was for the mornings after the bad nights. He learned to read them from half a mile away. He would crest the dune path and find the cottage smothered, fog lying on the coast like a held breath, a fine drizzle hanging in the air more than falling through it, the sea and sky welded into one gray. And he would know, before he ever saw her face, that she had spent the night somewhere he could not follow. On those mornings she would open the door with her eyes scrubbed and her voice level, and a lie of perfect politeness ready. Slept fine, thank you. And the fog would lie on the water until noon, mourning on her behalf, telling on her. He said nothing. He split wood, watched the sky, and kept count. The 7th day, the young mother from the pack hall came down the dune path with her pup. Her name was Senna. The pup was Briar, 4 years old, a round, fearless, half-feral scrap of a boy who had decided at the assembly, by whatever lights pup navigate, that the Silver Lady was his. Senna came with mending she did not need help with, and a curiosity she did not bother hiding. And while the adults circled each other with tea and careful talk, Briar marched directly up to Brooklyn, where she sat on the doorstep, planted himself in front of her, and demanded to see the swimming feet. The cottage went silent. Senna started forward mortified, and Brooklyn laughed. It broke out of her before she could stop it, a real laugh, rusty, astonished, bent in the middle, and to the end of his life, Dane never forgot what the sky did. The morning had been low and gray, woolly cloud from headland to headland, and the clouds tore. There was no other word for it. A seam of blue ripped open above the cottage, wide and sudden, and sunlight fell through it like something spilled. Across the doorstep, the grass shelf, the girl, the pup, one column of gold standing on the cottage, while the rest of the coast lay gray. Briar, 4 years old, and theologically unburdened, simply turned his face up into the warmth and said, "Again." Brooklyn stopped laughing. The seam in the clouds healed over slowly, and the gold faded off the grass, and Dane watched her remember herself, watched the wonder shut down, panel by panel, into fear. Her eyes went to Senna, braced for the recoil, but Senna only looked up at the mending sky and back at Brooklyn, and said in the brisk voice of a woman who had decided something, "Well, you'll be wanting to come to us for supper on Thursdays then. We could all use the fine weather." That night Dane stayed later than he meant to. The fire was down to coals. The lamp was turned low. Outside the deep-silled windows, the sea worked at the stones, patient, eternal, and the two of them sat at the small table with tea going cold between them, her hands wrapped around her cup, more for the holding than the drinking, and she had been telling him, in pieces, about nothing at all. Safe things. The whale watcher's books she would found in the chest under the bed. The seal had taken to hauling out on the beach below to stare at her, which she considered rude. Where she would learn to mend nets, which was the first drop stitch, a slip backward into before, and Dane kept his eyes on his cup, and his voice idle and asked nothing, and so, of course, she kept going. A cold water coast. North of here, she did not say how far, a smell of kelp drying on racks. Someone, she did not say who used to hum while the nets were mended, the same 3 notes over and over, until the whole family was humming it without knowing. "I catch myself doing it still," Brooklyn said. "The humming. I will be halfway through before I notice, and then I have to stop because," and her voice cracked, not loudly, just a hairline, on the last word, the sound a frozen pond makes long before anyone falls through. She shut her mouth and looked down into her cold tea, and her face did a thing Dane had already learned it did, going still and smooth, every hatch battened, and in the hush, on the cedar shingles above their heads, it began to rain. He heard it begin, That was the thing. There was no approach, no first far-off patter rolling in across the grass shelf, the way honest weather arrives. The hush of it started over the cottage. In the same instant her voice broke, soft and fine and total, as if the sky directly above the roof had simply let go of what it had been holding all evening. The fire ticked, the tea cooled. The rain came down on the shingles with a sound like the sea whispering, and Brooklyn sat with her eyes down and her hands around her cup, fighting some long, silent, practiced fight, and losing it, one slow tear at a time. Dane looked at the window. He did not mean anything by it. It was the tracker's reflex, guess a cataloger checking his ledger, eyes flicking to the dark glass, the streaks of silver running on it, confirming. Rain follows her tears. Noted. Filed. He was already turning back to her, already reaching for some gentle thing to say, when he found her watching him. She had caught it. Of course, she had caught it. She had spent a lifetime watching people watch the weather. Her eyes were wet and bright in the lamplight, and there was no surprise in them at all, only a terrible, ancient tiredness, the tiredness of a woman arriving at a familiar crossroads by a new road. "Say it," Brooklyn said. Dane held her gaze. He was done lying to her by silence. She would had a lifetime of people deciding what she could bear to hear. "The rain started when you did." She nodded slowly. She looked down at her tea, and a tear fell into it, and on the roof the rain thickened by exactly that much, and she laughed, one broken note, at the sheer rotten poetry of it. "It always does," she said. Her voice was hollowed out, scraped clean, the voice of the very tired, telling the very old truth. "Since I was 6 years old, rain for crying, wind for fear. The other things for the other feelings." She turned her cup a slow half-circle on the table. "You cannot hide anything, you know. That is what it really is. Other people get to grieve behind a door. I grieve in front of everyone, in the harbor, on the crops, on the boats. A bad week for me, and the whole coast pays it." Her eyes came up to his, sea green, rimmed red, terribly calm. "Well, on if you think I was alone in the ocean, Dane." The rain breathed on the shingles. The sea dragged at the stones below. He could have said any of the soft and useless things. He sorted through them all in the space of a breath, and threw them all away, because she would have heard each one for what it was, and because his wolf was standing up in his chest again, with that planted, immovable stance, and what came out of him came from there. "Gorski, the wrong question," Dane said. "It is not why we were alone in the ocean. It is why a woman who calls down the sky believes the sky is the unlovable part." Brooklyn went very still. "And I will tell you something else, since we are saying things." He stood, unhurried, and took his coat off the peg, because if he stayed any longer, he was going to say the rest of it, the part his wolf had been saying since the pack haul, and she was nowhere near ready, and neither, if he was honest, was he. He opened the door on the soft silver rain, and paused on the threshold, looking back at her in the lamplight, small, salt-made, impossible, the cup of cold tea between her hands. "It rained at my mother's burial," he said. "Hardest rain of that whole year. Every wolf on this coast stood in it, and not one of us wanted it dry. Some things are supposed to rain, Brooklyn. You have spent your whole life apologizing for being honest. Whether." He stepped out into it and pulled the door gently shut behind him. He was halfway up the dune path, soaked through and not caring, when the rain on his shoulders began to ease, softening, thinning, lifting away to nothing at all. He stopped on the crest of the dune and turned. Behind him, down on the grass shelf, the cottage windows glowed gold through the dark, and above the cottage, only above the cottage, the clouds had opened, and the stars were out, and they were reflected, every one, in a sea gone smooth as held breath. Dane stood a long time in the dark, looking. At that, then he turned for home and told no one. It was Mara, of all people, who forced the issue. The old midwife appeared at the cottage on a bright, cold morning in Brooklyn's 3rd week, walked in without knocking, looked the girl up and down with her sunken, seen-everything eyes, and announced that a wolf who never ran with a pack was not a guest. She was a ghost, and the Tradewinds had enough of those. "The young ones run the headland trail at dusk," Mara said, already leaving. "Be there. Wear something you can shift out of." She paused in the doorway, and her voice gentle by a degree nobody could have measured. "They are more afraid of you than you are of them, child. Wolves always are with new water. Let them get your scent and be done with it." So at dusk, terrified and hiding it, Brooklyn came to the headland and learned what Dane's world was. She had run as a wolf all her life, but alone, always alone, on empty coasts in the dark, the way a fugitive runs. She had never in her life run inside a pack, and nothing in her solitary years had prepared her for the sheer physical fact of it. 20 wolves bore along the headland trail in the failing light, and she was in the middle of them, and it was like being a drop of water that suddenly understands the river. The drum of paws on packed dirt came up through her own bones, not her rhythm, everyone's rhythm, one enormous shared heartbeat hammering through the ground. The heat of bodies bracketed her on both sides, shoulder height, breathing in time. The smell of it wrapped her whole, pine pitch and torn earth, crushed fern, warm fur, the green blood of broken undergrowth, the smell of the land, alive and thundering with her inside it. The pack moved like one animal, and thought like one animal, and the animal made room for her. That was the thing she could not get over. A young male dropped back to pace her through the tricky scree slope without being asked. The whole formation bent itself, smooth as water, around her in experience. When she missed the cutoff at the cliff fork, the wolf behind her simply shouldered her, gently, the right way, and nobody laughed, and nobody stared, and by full dark, Brooklyn was running in the body of the pack, with her ears flat to the wind, and something in her chest pulling so hard it frightened her. Dane ran point the whole way and never once looked back at her. He did not need to. That was what frightened her most. She could feel exactly where he was, the entire run, a fixed warm point in the dark ahead, like a lamp in a window, and when the pack finally broke apart in the home meadow, steaming and laughing and shifting back into shouting young people, his eyes found hers across all of it in half a second, flat, and the look in them was the same one she would been hiding all night. She started teaching him the sea 3 days later, and told herself it was repayment. It was justice anyway. On land he was effortless, and she was clumsy. In the water, the universe corrected its accounts. Dane was a powerful swimmer by any land wolf standard, which meant precisely nothing past the breaker line, and Brooklyn, patient, dry-voiced, merciless, set about dismantling everything he thought he knew. Stop fighting it. Treading water beyond the 3rd bar, gray swells rolling under them, her dark hair slicked back like sealskin. You swim like you are at war. The sea always wins the war, Dane. Always. You are not stronger than it. You are not braver than it. It does not care that you are an alpha. A swell lifted her and set her down. She did not even seem to notice. You cannot beat it. You can only be polite to it. Polite, Wop Salt scalded. Watch. And she went under, and he learned what her world was. He forced his eyes open in the sting, and saw her below him, down where the light turned thick and blue, where sound died into that vast pressing hush he remembered from the night of the storm. The cold gripped his skull, the pressure leaned on his ears. The muffled boom of the waves passing overhead was the heartbeat of some animal too large to imagine. And through that blue, silent, crushing country, Brooklyn moved like a ribbon in wind. No kicking, no fighting. Her whole body one long, fluent sentence, bending around currents he could not even feel. And he understood, watching her, that he was seeing the same thing she had seen on the headland. Creature inside the element that had been missing all its life. He lasted 30 seconds and surfaced like a kettle. She came up beside him, barely breathing hard, and the smug curve of her mouth was the most human thing he would ever seen on her, and Dane started laughing in the middle of the ocean, salt in his throat, laughing at his own drowned rat incompetence, at her insufferable grace, at all of it, and Brooklyn fought it hard, and lost, and broke up laughing with him, both of them treading water and howling like fools, off the edge of the world, and around them, unnoticed. Ray swells began to lie down, the weeks turned. The pack got her scent and, slowly, her measure. Cinna's Thursday suppers, Briar enthroned on her shoulders demanding the swimming feet, the young runners calling her Silver in a tone that had stopped being wary. The fishermen still folded their arms. Corvin still watched from the elder's bench with his pale, patient eyes. But the coast had its mildest autumn in living memory, week after week of soft weather and easy seas, and only 2 people on it knew the why of that, and neither of them said it aloud, because the why was the thing they were not saying. Dane felt the bond now, the way he felt weather coming, constantly, in the bones. A fixed warm point of her never left his awareness, half a mile south, asleep, on the water, gone diving, at Senna's, laughing. He knew, the way he knew where his own hands were. His wolf had stopped pacing and simply pointed, all day, every day, like a compass needle, with one heading. And Brooklyn had started flinching when their hands brushed, not from distaste. He knew what distaste looked like. She flinched, the way you flinch back from the edge of a long drop, when the falling is what you want. It broke open on a dive, because of course it did. She would be teaching him breath, the long, slow discipline of it, how to hang below the surface and spend air like a miser, and they were out past the breakers in the late gold of the afternoon, in that hour when the sea goes to glass and bronze. He would done it properly for once, slipped under without fighting, hung in the blue hush, let the cold be the cold, politeness, as instructed. And she had circled him slowly in the falling light with her hair adrift around her face like dark kelp, checking his form, and the low sun had come slanting down through the water in long cathedral shafts, and she had stopped circling. They hung there 6 feet under the bright skin of the world, looking at each other. Neither of them ever knew how long. Time did not run right down there. The light fell in gold bars through the blue. The hush pressed in, that enormous, gentle pressure, the whole weight of her world holding them both like cupped hands, and her eyes were lit from inside the way they had been on the first night, and the distance between them was closing without either of them swimming, the sea itself handing them quietly toward each other. They surfaced into sunset a breath apart, and the sea was glass, not calm. Calm was a word for ordinary days. The water around them had gone utterly, impossibly still, no swell, no chop, no breath of texture, a single smooth sheet of molten bronze from their 2 heads to the horizon, so flat it held the clouds whole, like the sky had been laid down for safekeeping. The waves had stopped against the distant shore, the gulls had gone quiet, the world stood with held breath, and Brooklyn floated in the middle of all that stillness, inches from him, salt beating on her lashes and her lips parted, and Dane understood. It went through him like cold water down the spine. Rain for her grief, wind for her fear, lightning, Corvin claimed, for her anger. And this miraculous stillness, this glass, the mild autumn, the gentle seas, the weeks of soft weather, the fishermen kept calling luck. This was her joy. Lying on the water for 10 miles in every direction, and it had begun the week he started coming to the cottage. He was the first thing in her whole hunted life that had ever made the weather gentle. Brooklyn, he said. Her name came out wrecked, and she saw it in his face, saw that he knew, saw what he was about to do or say, saw the bond standing plainly between them at last in the bronze light, and the terror went through her so fast that a wind out of nowhere riffled the glass sea, and she backed away from him, through the water. Do not. Her voice cracked the stillness. Do not say it. You feel it. Not a question. The wind ruffled the bronze around them, fretting. You have felt it since the beach. Brooklyn, I know what it is. She was treading backward, putting yards between them, and the flat sea was breaking up into cat's paws and shivers. The skies held breath coming apart. I know what you kind call it. I have heard the stories my whole life. The bond, the mates, the moon ties the knot, and that is that. You think it is a gift? Her laugh came out salt bitter. Bonds are just another word for being owned. Dane, that is all they have ever been for me. Every single person who ever found out what I am wanted to own it. The ones who were afraid tried to drown me, and the ones who were not afraid were worse. They wanted to point me. A girl who can sink ships on a rope, that is what a bond is. It is a rope, and I have spent my whole life chewing through ropes, and now your moon wants to put one on me that I cannot. Her voice broke. The wind gusted hard across the water, that I cannot chew through, she finished very quietly, because I can already feel that I will not want to. And that is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me. The sea chopped and fretted around them. The bronze was gone. Dane trod water where he was, and did not close the distance she would made, and that the not closing she would think about later, lying awake. He just stayed, easy in the chop she would raise, getting slapped in the jaw by it, watching her with those steady storm-gray eyes. Not in my pack, he said. What? A bond? You said it is a rope, being owned. Not in my pack. The wind tore the words around. He raised his voice and kept it level. The speaking stone voice, the one that made things law. In my pack, a bond means someone stands in the storm with you. That is the whole of it. Not in front of you, holding your leash. Not behind you, hiding, with you, in it. As long as it lasts, however bad it gets. The water heaved between them. Brooklyn's eyes were bright and furious and drowning. I am the storm, she said. Dane smiled at her across the chop. That slow, planted, immovable smile. The smile of a man whose wolf had decided weeks ago and was only waiting for the rest of him to file the paperwork. Then I will get wet. For 3 full seconds the sea did not know what to do. Neither did she. He watched it war in her face. The terror and the pull, the rope and the open water, every escape she would ever swum, and the one fixed warm point in the dark that her whole hunted body was pointing at, like a compass needle, and the wind around them stuttered, gusted, died, rose, died again, weather flickering with her heart like a lamp in a draught. Then Brooklyn did what Brooklyn did. She went under, one smooth backward roll, barely a ripple, and was gone, a silver-blue shadow flickering away through the deepening gold toward shore, faster than he could ever hope to follow. Dane floated, lone, in the middle of the unsettled sea, watching her wake fade, hurting in a brand-new place. But all the long swim home, through water that could not decide but it was feeling, through stretches of chop that softened, strangely, the nearer he drew to the beach below her cottage, through patches of stillness that kept blooming around him like something following him in, like something that could not help itself. Dane was smiling, because the sky over the headland was doing 6 things at once, fear and want and fury and grief, but it was not raining. She came back to him 4 nights later, the way the tide comes back, without apology, without announcement, as if leaving and returning were simply what her nature did. Dane was on the stone beach below her cottage when it happened. He had taken to walking there in the evenings, which fooled no one, least of all himself. The night was moonless and mild, the sea breathing slow against the stones, and he heard nothing. She never made sound when she did not want to, but the fixed warm point in his chest swung near and nearer, and then Brooklyn was standing beside him at the edge of the tide pools, with her arms wrapped around herself, looking out at the dark water. For a while, neither of them said anything. The sea filled the silence the way it filled everything else. You did not follow me, she said at last. After the swim, you did not come to the cottage. 4 days. You went under to get away from me, Dane said. A man who follows you after that is not standing in the storm with you. He is just another thing chasing you. She looked at him then, sidelong, in the starlight, and whatever she found in his face must have weighed out, because she let out a long breath that the wind off the water copied exactly, and lowered herself to sit on the cold stone at the rim of the largest tide pool, and after a moment she patted the rock beside her. Sit down, Alpha, Brooklyn said quietly. You want to know what I am. So do half your wolves, and all of your elders, and you have been too courteous to ask, and I am tired of being a riddle. Sit down, and I will tell you where I came from, and then you can decide what to do about your moon and its rope. He sat. The stone was cold through his coat. Below them, the tide pool lay black and still as poured ink. Brooklyn trailed her fingers through the water, an absent gesture, the way another woman might smooth her skirt, and the pool lit. Dane had seen sea fire before. Every coast wolf had. Faint green sparks in a boat's wake on warm nights, a glow in the surf line in late summer. He had never seen it like this. The bioluminescence flared around her trailing fingers in bright streaming ribbons, blue-white, alive, every tiny creature in the pool answering her touch at once, like filings answering a magnet, and when she withdrew her hand, the light followed it to the surface and held there a moment, reaching, before it faded. She watched it die down. Her mouth twisted, not quite a smile. They always do that, she said. The small lives. They know their own. She wiped her wet fingers on her knee, looked out at the Black Sea, and began. I was born in the cold currents north of here. I will not tell you how far, and you will understand why before I am done. My people called themselves the Maelstrom clan, though there were only 9 families of us left by the time I came. 9 families, hiding in the gray water, off coasts with no names. Her voice, as she settled into the telling, did something Dane had heard before, in old soldiers, in shipwreck survivors, in wolves who had buried pups. It went flat, even, rehearsed, the voice of a story that had been told so many times inside one skull that all the jagged edges had been handled smooth, because the teller could not have survived the telling otherwise. We lived between, she said. That is the only way to say it. Land wolves live on the land. We lived between the land and the deep. Sea caves, skerries, islands too small and bitter for men to want. We came ashore to birth our pups and dry our nets and sing, and we went into the water for everything else. The sea fed us. The sea hid us. We worked the cold currents the way your pack works the headland forest, and we knew the underneath of that coast the way you know your trails, every cave, every wreck, every singing rock. Some seals knew us by name. I'm not being poetic. There were. The wind moved gently over the tide pools, stirring the starlight on them. We had 3 laws. Never be seen shifting. Never sleep twice in the same cove when strangers are near. And never ever let the blood gift show. Her flat voice gave the words the cadence of catechism. Rules learned before memory, with bread and bedtime. The blood gift came down one of the 9 lines. My mother's line. It skipped, mostly. Once in 3 generations, the elders said, a child the sky listens to. My great-grandmother had it. They say she could whistle fog and part channel to hide the clan's boats, and that she once held off a gale for 3 days while the families moved den, and that it cost her a year of her life for every day. The sky does not give. My grandmother used to say, the sky trades. Brooklyn's fingers found the water again. The blue-white fire ribboned up around them, eager, and lit her face from below, and her face in that light was the worst thing Dane had seen since the night on the beach, calm, composed, and 1,000 years old. I manifested at 6, he said, and I was not a fog whistler. It was small things first. The clan was patient. They would had the gift in the line before. There were rules for it, songs for it. Calm lessons. The old ones took turns minding my weather, like you would mind a fire, and it worked mostly, because I was a happy child, if you can believe that. The dead-level voice did not change at all, which was how Dane knew they had reached the part that had been sanded longest. And then, the spring I was 9, my mother went out with the deep-current cruise, after the long-lining boats came too close to our grounds, and the cruise came back, and she did not. The wind stopped, not eased, stopped, the way the storm had stopped on the night of the rescue, the whole night, or breathless around them, and Dane understood that he was inside her memory's weather now, that the sky was remembering with her. They never let me see the nets, Brooklyn said. I want you to understand that they did everything right. They were good people. They held me. They sang the laments. They told me grief was water, and water belongs to us. But I was 9 years old, and my mother was gone, and I felt it the way you feel things at 9, with everything, with the whole world, and the sky. She turned her hand over, palm up, empty. Sky felt it with me. For 4 days. She did not describe the hurricane. Dane noticed that, and never forgot it, that the one event her whole life hinged on was the one she stepped past in a single sentence, the way you would step past a grave. 4-day storm out of a clear spring sky, off a cold coast where no such storm had ever come so early. Boats got lost up and down 100 miles of shore. A fishing town's harbor was smashed. And in the records of the weathermen, far away in their warm offices, an anomaly, unforecast, inexplicable, worth investigating. And that, Brooklyn said flat as slate, is how they found us. Not wolfsbane, not informants, mathematics. There are men. They are always there, Dane, every coast, every generation. They pass it down like a trade, who knew the old stories were true and had been waiting 100 years for proof. And a wakmes proof you could see from space. A grief, 9 years old, 4 days long, sitting in one fixed spot on an empty coast where no people were supposed to be. She laughed once, a sound with nothing in it. They did not even have to hunt. They just had to do the arithmetic and come look at the answer. They came in the 3rd winter after. By then I would had 2 more episodes, smaller, but enough for the pattern, and the men who do the arithmetic are patient. The rehearsed voice moved on, level, naming the unbearable in the smoothed-down words of a survivor's liturgy. The night the clan's sentries did not sing the all-clear, the lights on the water that were not fishing boats, her grandmother's hands shoving her into the deep channel, with the order that was the last thing anyone ever said to her: swim, and feel nothing, swim cold, swim empty, until you are past where the sky can hear you. I was 12, Brooklyn said. I swam for 2 days. I have spent every year since doing the second half of what she said, feeling nothing, swimming cold, because I worked out the arithmetic too, you see. The men with the instruments only ever found us when I felt something. My heart is a beacon, Dane. It has been since I was 6 years old. Every person who ever sheltered me, I lit up for the whole sky to see, and so I stopped being sheltered. I stopped being anywhere. 20 years, coast to coast, never twice in the same cove. Her eyes came up to his, sea green, terribly steady. Every storm on this coast for 20 years that the forecasts are wrong. That was me, somewhere, feeling something. The tide pool glimmered faintly between her fingers, the small lives still reaching for her. So now you know what washed up on your sand, she said. Not a miracle, a lit flare, with a pulse. And the night, you pulled me out of the water, and the storm died. That calm went into somebody's records too, Dane. Somewhere warm and far away, a man who inherited the arithmetic looked at the numbers off this coast and underlined them. She looked back out at the black water, and her voice, for the first time all night, stopped being flat, dropped low, and tired, and afraid in the oldest way. That is what I meant on the beach. It knows where I am. Maybe it is only the men. Probably it is only the men. Dane heard the word she chose. Probably. Brooklyn. What else could it be? She was quiet for a long moment. The sea breathed against the stones. My grandmother used to say the gift came from the deep itself. That the first mother of our line made a bargain down there, in the cold dark below the light, and the sky listening was the payment, and that the deep does not forget what it is owed. She shook her head slowly. Clan tales. Stories for the storm season. We were a people made of stories. We had nothing else to carry. Everything we owned had to fit in a diving sack. The bitter boast of a smile. But I will tell you the one I think about. The lament my grandmother sang every year on the longest night. The one the whole clan knew. Older than the 9 families. Older than anything. A grieving song. Not for the dead. We had other songs for the dead. This one was for the living. For wolves who were still alive somewhere. Warm somewhere. And had forgotten us. She sang it then. Very softly, half under her breath. A dozen words in a tongue Dane did not know. Old, salt-worn. The melody rising and falling like a swell. And then she gave it to him in his own language. Flat again. The sanded, smooth voice of the survivor reciting. Cold keeps faith. Stone keeps faith. The tide keeps faith with the drowned. But warm were the fires of the land brothers, who turned their backs. The phrase meant nothing to Dane. He filed it the way he filed everything about her, carefully, completely, but it landed in him as poetry, as the grief of a vanished people, sad and shapeless. The land brothers who turned their backs, some old clan sorrow, worn anonymous by time. He would remember later every detail of that moment, the black water, the cold stone. Brooklyn's voice fading on the last word, and the hush after, and the small blue lives glimmering in the pool, and the one detail he missed, up on the cliff path above the cove, where the trail from the village bent around the shoulder of rock, close enough in that breathless, windless, grieving stillness, for an old wolf's ears to catch every word rising off the water. Elder Corvin stood unmoving in the dark. His lantern shuddered, his hand pressed hard against the stone. He had come down quietly to see for himself what his Alpha did with his evenings. He had gotten his answer twice over. The Land brothers who turned their backs. The old man stood for a long time after the voices below had softened into other, gentler things. Anyone passing, no one passed, would have thought him turned to stone. An old gray wolf leaning on the cliff with his head bowed, his lips moving without sound, not in prayer, in translation. Word for word in a tongue no living Tradewinds wolf but one had ever heard spoken aloud, checking the girl's rendering against a version he had read 100 times by candlelight, in a locked room, in his grandfather's hand. It was accurate. Corvin shuttered his eyes the way he was shuttered his lantern, and stood in the dark above the two glowing figures on the beach, and made his decision. The ledger room had no windows. That was by design. And the design was 300 years old. Light fades ink, damp swells paper, curiosity does worse than either. So the keepers of the Tradewinds histories had built their archive into the stone hill behind the pack hall, like a root cellar, one heavy door, one lamp hook, and wall upon wall of shelved ledgers, going back to the founding, in a cool, dry dark that smelled of leather, tallow, dust, and time. But one shelf. It stood in the deepest corner, behind the keeper's writing desk, fitted with a door of oak slats and an iron lock, whose key had been passed, hand to hand, keeper to keeper, for 10 generations, and unlike every other shelf in that scrupulously dry room, it smelled, faintly, of mildew. Corvin had wondered about that all his life. The room was dry, the shelf was not. As a young keeper, he had treated the wood, changed the caulking, fought that smell with every trick the trade knew, and the smell had outlasted every effort, rising off the locked oak, like a stain rising through paint. Salt damp and old paper and something underneath, the smell of a thing shut away wet that had never, in 200 years, entirely dried. His grandfather, who had given him the key, had called it the smell of the dead. Corvin sat at the keeper's desk in the lamplight, an old man wrapped in gray, listened to the lament rising off the water in his memory, and looked at the shelf for a long time. Then he took out paper, mixed ink, and began to write, not in his own hand, the blocky, characterless print of a man who has written anonymous letters before, or has spent a lifetime reading enough hands to counterfeit having none. To the Coastal Meteorological Survey, the letter began, for the attention of the Anomalous Events Office. There was no such office listed in any directory. Corvin knew the address anyway. It was in the locked shelf, in his grandfather's papers, copied down generations ago for a purpose no keeper had ever written out loud. Know where the wolves' enemies live, so you will know if they move. The men who did the arithmetic had had many names down the long years. A whaling syndicate once, a salvage firm, a survey office now. The address changed every few decades. The patience behind it was never there. He wrote 4 sentences. Persistent unforecast weather anomalies on the northern coast, centered within 2 miles of the headland at Tradewinds Point. Onset 11 weeks ago, coinciding with local reports of a woman recovered from the sea during the storm of the autumn equinox. Calm water and clear sky events correlate with the woman's residence at a cottage on the southern shore of the point. The pattern is consistent with your office's historical interests. He did not sign it. He sanded it, folded it, sealed it with plain wax, and sat with it in his 2 hands by the lamp for a long time, long enough for the lamp to burn down a finger's width, and to his own surprise, the old man wept a little, dry and quiet, the way stone weeps in a thaw. Then he put the letter in his coat to go south with the next trade wagon, addressed from a town 50 miles down the coast. He told himself what the men of his line had always told themselves, in the same room, by the same lamp, with the same smell of the dead in their throats. Someone must count the whole pack. Someone must do the arithmetic. He was not a cruel man. He had checked, all his life, the way you check a lock. He was not cruel. He took no pleasure in this. He would have wept to watch it. See, he was weeping now. He was merely the only wolf alive who knew what followed the seaborn, as night follows day. as the tide follows the moon, and the only one old enough to understand that it could not be fought, only outrun, and that the Tradewinds had outrun it for 200 years by one means alone: distance. Bought once at a price so terrible, the pack had turned it into children's stories rather than remember it true. The girl on the southern shore was the bill, washed in on the tide, come due. Better one stranger taken from a beach, Corvin thought, putting out the lamp, than 9 families found again. His grandfather's arithmetic. It had not even needed dusting. The council fire was light 2 nights later, and Corvin did not call for the girl's exile. That was the masterstroke, and Dane did not see it for what it was until the damage was done. The old keeper had stood in the pack hall 11 weeks ago and demanded she be cast out, and he had lost, and everyone had watched him lose. Now Hazar wrapped in gray on the elder's bench at the council fire, in the smoke and the pitchlight, and when the autumn accounting came round, the season's losses, read into the record as they had been read every year for 3 centuries, he asked for nothing at all. He only kept the ledger. As was his office, as was his right. The Maris boat, Corvin read in his dry teacher's voice, while the green pine smoke drifted and stung the eyes of 40 gathered heads of family. Auster mast and half her gear in the gale of the 9th week. The gale, the record will show, that rose in the evening without warning, out of a sky the morning watch called fair. He turned a page, unhurried. The lowland dens, flooded twice this season, flooded once in the previous 4 years. The record notes the second flood, followed within hours of the disturbance at the pack hall, when the stranger was first brought before us. Another page, the paper whispering. Alderey's nets, carried off the drying racks by straight-line wind on the night of, I will check the night. It was the night the Alpha's swimming lessons ended early, I believe. The record only notes the wind. The record notes, said Dane, from the head of the fire, a bad autumn. The record notes the mildest autumn in living memory, Corvin corrected gently, and that was the trap, sprung so softly it never made a sound. The mildest autumn in living memory, Alpha, broken by 6 violent events, each rising out of calm, each unforecast, each local to our coast, and no other. The fishing villages south of us have had no such season. I have checked. He looked up from the ledger, the firelight in the seams of his old face, and his voice held nothing but sorrow. I lay no charge. I name no cause. I am the keeper. I keep. But this council is owed the whole record, and the whole record is this: our good weather and our disasters now arrived together, woven of one cloth. We did not use to live at the mercy of anyone's heart. He closed the ledger. He did not once say her name. He never said her name in council again, and that was what made it unanswerable. You cannot call a man a liar for reading losses out of a ledger. Every word of it was true. The Maris boat had lost her mast to Brooklyn's 4 bad days. The lowland dens had flooded under her grief twice. The nets had blown off the racks the night she fled Dane in the water. Some of it was even worse than Corvin knew. And Dane stood at the head of the council fire with the smoke stinging his eyes and a truth sitting in his mouth like a stone, the truth that would save her, the truth that would damn her, the same truth, yes. The weather is her heart, and her heart, since she came to us, has been gentler than this coast has ever known, and you are reading out the 6 nights it broke. He could not say it. Saying it confirmed everything. Not saying it conceded everything. The old man had built a door with no good side, so Dane defended her, the only way left, with himself. He stood and reminded the council whose protection she stood under, and what the law of hospitality said, and what his word was worth on this coast, and the council heard him out in the silence that was worse than argument, because it was not the silence of wolves being persuaded. It was the silence of wolves measuring their alpha, standing alone in the firelight, spending the authority of 11 good years on a stranger from the sea, while the keeper of 300 years of records sat quietly behind him, with the ledger of her cost open on his knees. Heads of family who had back Dane in the pack hall would not meet his eyes across the fire. Senna spoke for Brooklyn, fierce and alone, and was heard with courtesy, which is how a council buries a thing. The fishermen's faces were shut. Old Garrick of the lowlands, whose dens had flooded, who had carried Dane on his shoulders as a pup, stood up and said only this, that he did not quarrel with any guest, but that he had pups of his own to think of, and that an alpha's first bond was supposed to be to his pack, supposed to be. Then he sat down, and would not look at his alpha either, and the fire crackled in the long quiet. An alpha can protect a stranger from outsiders, and the pack will sing about it, protecting her from the pack itself. Dane felt the cost of that leaving him all night long, like heat leaving a body. Not rebellion, nothing so clean. Just wolves, drifting from him by inches around a fire, while an old man read true things in a kind voice. It was Corvin who closed the council, because by then it was somehow Corvin's council to close. He waited for Dane by the hall door afterward, in the cold air, away from the others, courteous, ever leaning on his stick. And the thing that made the moment unbearable, the thing Dane never forgot, was that the old man's compassion was not feigned. It would have been so much easier if it had been. I watched you tonight, Corvin said, and I grieve for you, and that is the truth. You think I am your enemy. Lad, Alpha, I taught you your letters. I buried your father with these hands. His pale eyes were wet in the lantern light. His voice stayed soft, reasonable, and kind, and it went into Dane like a blade going in slowly. I do not hate the girl, Alpha. I pity her. I pity her more than you will ever understand, and more than I am free to say. But a wolf who can drown a harbor when her heart breaks does not get the luxury of heartbreak among us. That is not cruelty. That is the oldest arithmetic there is, and it does not care that the two of you are. And here the old man paused, and chose with terrible gentleness, not to say the word, that the two of you are what you are. Send her somewhere kinder than a council fire, Dane. Soon, while the choice is still yours. He inclined his head, correct to the last, and went off slowly into the dark with his stick tapping the stones. Dane stood outside the hall a long while, in the smoke smell and the cold, with the wrongness of the whole night crawling on him, and refusing to settle anywhere he could see it, that last phrase circling, while the choosing is still yours. Far to the south, a tradewagon rolled down the coast road in the dark, carrying mail, and out on the black water, beyond the breakers, the mildest autumn in living memory, lay glass calm under the stars, 10 miles of held breath, telling anyone who knew how to read it exactly where she was. The longest night, fires had burned on the headland meadow every winter for 300 years. It was the Tradewinds' great gathering, the whole pack under the open sky on the year's darkest evening, fires in a ring, the harvest shared out, the old songs sung against the dark. Pups stayed up until they dropped and were carried home over shoulders. Feuds were suspended by custom and mostly by drink. Even the worst winters had never cancelled it. The pack had sung the longest night through blizzards, through morning years, through war. And this year, for the first time in anyone's life, the question had actually been asked in council, quietly, sideways, no names, whether it was wise to put the whole pack in one open meadow by firelight on the cliffs. Dane had answered the question by attending with Brooklyn on his arm. It was a declaration, and everyone knew it. She had known it too, and had nearly refused. He would watched her stand in the cottage doorway in the borrowed green dress Anna had taken in for her, gripping the frame like the land was pitching, and then Briar had come barreling up the dune path ahead of his mother, shouting that the Silver Lady had to come because he relearned a song with howling in it, and that had been that. Nobody had ever taught the boy that she was a question. To Briar, she was simply his, the way the moon was, and arguments did not apply. For 3 hours it was the best night of her life. Dane knew it without looking at her, knew it from the sky. The longest night came in still and strangely mild, windless, the stars enormous over the black water, the ring of fires standing straight as candles. Old wolves remarked on it all evening, the uncanny gentleness of the dark, the sea lying quiet below the cliffs like a dog by a hearth. Brooklyn sat in the firelight with Briar asleep against her side before the singing was half done, and Senna's family around her, and the young runners who called her Silver, and when the great chorus came, the whole pack howling the year down together, 300 voices of the living and remembered. Dane watched her lift her face and sing with his wolves, her eyes shining, the firelight gold on her skin, Above the meadow, slow and silent, the northern lights came out. They had no business this far south. They unrolled across the whole sky in ribbons of green and violet, vast and tender, and the pack gasped and pointed, and the pups screamed with joy, and only 2 people on the headland knew they were watching a woman's happiness, written in fire on the roof of the world. Her joy, visible, Dane would think later, for 100 miles. The boats came in with no lights, at the dead of the festival, steering on the Aurora. The first anyone knew was the flare. It went up from the south watch with a hiss and a bang, the old signal, strangers ashore, that had not been fired in earnest in 30 years, and for one fatal half-minute, pack on the meadow stood frozen in the firelight, drunk and dazzled and full of song, staring south. Then the night spoke with a voice none of the young wolves had ever heard, and all the old ones had, a flat, distant crack, and another, and another. Rifles, and on the cliff path from the south shore, the first hunters walked up into the light of the outermost fire. Men in dark sea gear, unhurried, instruments slung at their chests alongside the guns, and the one in front raised a device that swept the crowd with a thin red line until it found what it was looking for and held, steady as arithmetic, on the woman in the green dress. Brooklyn's terror broke the sky. There was no rising of it, no warning gusts. Dane had seen her weather come on a dozen times, felt the lag heartbeat to sky, like thunder counting off a lightning flash. There was no lag now. Between one breath and the next, the windless night became a fist. The gale came down on the headland out of nowhere and everywhere, a single annihilating blow off the sea that flattened the ring of fires sideways into sheets of sparks that took the great central blaze apart and threw it burning across the meadow, that hit the standing pack like floodwater and put a third of them on the ground. And then it began to scream, and the world came apart into pieces. This was what Dane would remember. Pieces. The wind was so loud it erased voices. Wolves shouting orders. Wolves shouting names. Mothers screaming for pups 3 feet away. And all of it gone, snatched out of mouths and shredded. The whole night reduced to one toneless oceanic roar, in which nothing human survived. Rain arrived horizontally, hard as gravel, stinging blind. The dark between lightning was total, and the lightning had begun. Corvin's lightning, the dry kind, walking down out of the boiling sky in white legs, striking the cliff, the meadow's lone oak, the sea, and in the strobe of it, the night came in frozen frames, the pack scattering, a burning tint, cartwheeling, the hunters on the path staggering, their red line gone, their arithmetic drowning in the very thing it hunted. Senna's face, lit white, mouth open on a name, the feast. Awnings going up like sails, poles snapping, the big oak coming down across the fire pits in a burst of embers, the awning over the pup's corner, collapsing. The wind dropped for half a second, the storm gathering its breath, and in that half second of ringing near silence, the whole meadow heard it. Thin and high and coming from under the fallen tangle of canvas and snapped spars, where the smallest wolves had been bedded down asleep in a warm pile an hour ago. A pup crying. Briar. Dane was there before he knew he had moved, tearing at canvas with a dozen others, with Senna clawing beside him. And the wind came back and tried to take the wreckage out of their hands, tried to take them off their feet, and they got the spar up and the sodden canvas back, and there he was, small and gray-faced in the lightning strobe, pinned at the leg, soaked, bleeding from the head where the spar had caught him alive, crying that thin, terrible cry with the rain driving down into his face. Senna got her body over her son's. Doc Hale arrived on his knees, already working, and Dane looked up, and across the wrecked and burning meadow, through the horizontal rain, he found Brooklyn. She stood alone in the open, exactly where the red line had found her, as if she would never moved, the green dress soaked black, her hair whipping, the gale wheeling around her like a wounded thing around its heart. She was staring at the collapsed awning, at the pup, at Senna's bowed back, and the pack, his pack, scattered, soaked, bleeding, terrified. The pack was staring too, not at the hunters retreating down the cliff path, driven back to their boats by the impossible weather, at her. Every face that turned toward her in the lightning was a face she knew. Not these faces, but she knew them. The young runner who had called her Silver an hour ago, with his arm around her shoulders in the singing, staring now, white-eyed, from the mud. Old Garrick, holding two of his grandpups against his chest, was turning them away from her. The fishermen, whose faces had never opened, watched their every closed suspicion strike the meadow as fire from the sky. She had seen these faces on every coast of her life. She had a name for this moment. She had been waiting for it since the first fire, since the borrowed dress, since the moment she would let a 4-year-old fall asleep against her side and believed, for 3 hours, in the lights she would hung across the sky. Dane saw it happen. He saw her leave. Not her body. Her body stood rooted in the rain. But everything behind her eyes packed itself in a single second and went, the way it must have gone in every cove, on every coast, the practiced, total departure of a creature that has only ever had one home, and the home is away. Brooklyn, the gale ate his voice whole. He was up, running, vaulting the fallen oak, and she was moving now too, not running, worse, walking, steady, certain, down the meadow toward the cliff stairs, the sea, the storm bending around her like a retinue. He caught her at the top of the stairs. He did not dare grab her wrist. Even then, even there, he remembered. So he threw himself around in front of her, into the wind's teeth, shouting into the half-foot between them, where words could still live. It is not you they came for. It is, listen to me. We fight. The pack stands, and we fight. That is what a pack is. Look at your pack, Dane. Her voice was not loud. It carried anyway, the way a voice carries, when the storm around it is its own. Lightning lit her face, and her face was calm, and the calm was the most frightening thing he had ever seen, because it was the grandmother's order, 20 years rehearsed, finally and fully obeyed. Feel nothing, swim cold, swim empty. Look at them looking at me. I did that. Your festival, your boats, were oak that was old when your pack came here. Me. The boy. And there the calm cracked. One hairline. The whole sky convulsed white. Briar. That was me, Dane. My fear did that. My fear will always do that. It has a body count. And tonight it nearly, he is alive. He is alive. And a pack survives its storms together. That is the whole. You said you would stand in the storm with me. She looked up at him through the driving rain, and the rain on her face was indistinguishable from the rest of it, which was how she would lived her whole life, and her eyes were sea-green and lit, and already gone, looking at him from somewhere out past the breakers. Nobody survives that, Brooklyn said. Asked my family. And she stepped sideways off the top of the cliff stairs, off the edge of the world, and was gone down the black air, and the sea received her without a sound that anyone could have heard over the wind. By the time Dane reached the beach, hurling himself down the streaming stairs, the storm was already dying. That was the horror of it. He stood on the stones where he had once breathed her back to life, screaming her name at the water, and the gale unraveled around him as he screamed, the wind falling from a roar to a moan to a whisper to nothing, the rain thinning, stopping, the clouds sliding apart overhead with terrible serenity to show the stars, the swells dropping rank by rank like soldiers told to stand down. Within minutes, the sea before him lay flat, not glass calm. He knew her glass calm now. It was the stillness of joy, and it had a shine to it, a held tenderness. This was different. This was utter, unnatural, dead, a sea with nothing on its surface, and nothing in its voice, a flatness like a pulled-down shade, like a face willed empty, like the dial tone after the line goes dead. The water did not lap. On that whole long beach of stones, in the windless silence, the sea made no sound at all. She was not drowning. She was doing what her grandmother taught her. Somewhere out under that dead flat water, swimming north into the cold, Brooklyn was feeling nothing, perfectly, finally nothing, and the silence of the sea was the sound of her succeeding, and in Dane's chest, the bond went quiet, not snapped. He would have snapped. Every wolf knew the stories, mates dropping mid-stride like shot birds and the thread cut. This was worse because it kept almost being there. The fixed warm point that had burned at the edge of his awareness for 3 months, half a mile south, asleep, on the water, diving, at Senna's, laughing, faded as he stood there, dimmed, receded, like a lamp carried away down a long hall, like a voice heard from underwater, present, unreachable, wrapped in fathoms. His wolf hurled itself against the inside of his ribs, and what came back along the bond was cold, and pressure, and distance, and deliberate, merciful, practiced silence. She was muffling it, muffling them. Sparing him, the only way she knew. Dane stood in the surf line and could not make himself move. The tide came in around his boots. He felt it soak through, cold, indifferent, rising, and he stood there. Up on the cliff behind him, the pack was calling his name, torches gathering at the head of the stairs, voices small and raw in the enormous silence. Alpha, Alpha, the wounded to be counted, the fires to be doused, Briar to be carried in, 300 frightened wolves needing the only thing Alpha is, which is the one who turns around. The flat sea lay before him all the way to the world's edge, holding the stars perfectly, saying nothing. The tide rose over his boots. The pack called, and the last star reflections were beginning to blur. The first faint texture were Philostroids Brompearl, the first dead calm loosening at its far edges as she swam beyond the reach of his coast, or of her own resolve. When Dane finally turned his back on the sea and climbed the stairs to his wolves, with his boots full of cold salt water, and did not look behind him, the sky over the headlands stayed clear, still, and empty for 9 days. It was the worst weather of his life. On the 9th day, the bond moved. Dane had spent those 9 days being an alpha, because 300 wolves required it of him, and because the alternative was the cliff stairs and the flat sea and the screaming. He had buried himself in the work of the wrecked meadow, roofs, boats, the long, tense councils, Briar's small bandaged head, and slow, loud, miraculous recovery, and through all of it, he had carried the muffled bond in his chest like a stone he could not put down. A warmth under fathoms, present, unreachable, fixed, that was the thing he clung to, lying awake. For 9 days, the dimmed point of her had not moved. He could not feel her, not truly, but he could feel where she was, the way you can feel the direction of a window in a dark room, north along the coast, and out, not far, not gone. Holding somewhere in the cold water beyond his maps, as if some part of her resolve had failed at the leaving itself, or as if she were waiting for the weather of him to fade off her heart before she swam out of the world. On the 9th night, near moonrise, the point of warmth began to drift. North. She was leaving. Dane was out of the Alpha's house before his conscious mind had finished the sentence. Down through the sleeping village, down the dune path past her cold, dark cottage, out onto the stone beach where the winter sea ran black and serious under a half-moon. He stripped off coat and boots with his heart slamming at his wolf up and howling in him. And there at the surf line, with the cold already aching in his feet, the last of his reason caught up and made its argument. A land alpha, alone, diving past the breakers at night, in winter. Every drowned generation of this coast in his ear, every rule he would thrashed into reckless pups. No boat, no line, no light. Cold that killed swimmers in an hour, and divers faster, dark in which a man could not tell up from down, and his quarry, the strongest creature in that water, moving away through her own element at a pace he could not hope to match. Suicide, the word was not poetry, it was a sailing fact. The sea always wins the war. You cannot beat it, she would told him, treading the gray swells, 100 years ago, in the autumn. You can only be polite to it. Right then, Dane said to the sea, alone in the dark, like a madman. I'm coming in, politely. And he went. The cold hit like the night of the rescue, and then kept hitting, past the gasp, past the iron band around the chest, into the deep ache of true winter water that began to subtract him the moment it had him. He swam out hard through the breaker line, dove under the 3rd bar the way she would drilled him, surfaced beyond in the long black swells. The shorelight swung away behind. The half-moon ran on the water. He fixed his mind on the warmth in his chest, the dimmed lamp far down the long hall, north and out, and that became everything. That was the dive, the whole of it, the part he could never afterward put into words for anyone but her. The world reduced itself to three things: the enormous cold, the dark, which was total once the moon clouded over, and the bond. A thread of warmth in the black, thin as a hair, the only fixed point in a universe of heaving, lightless water. And Dane learned, somewhere in that endless swim, what the bond actually was, beneath all the moon talk and the mate talk and the pack lore. It was orientation, the single warm direction, the knowledge and black world of where home stood, burning in his chest at an angle to the dark, a star he steered by because there were no others, while the cold subtracted him, and the swells came on and his arms went from pain to wood to rumor. He could not have said how long. The cold ate time along with everything else. He knew the thread strengthened, the lamp brightening down the hall, the fathoms thinning, and he knew the moment it stopped retreating, the moment she felt him out there. Where it flared, wild, terror, fury, disbelief. He could read it again, suddenly, like a sky, and swung around and came toward him fast, and the black water below Dane lit up. She came up under him out of the deep trailing ribbons of sea fire, every small life in the winter water igniting around. Her passage, a silver-blue wolf, burning through the dark like the moon swimming, and she broke the surface beside him in a gasp of spray, shifted, human, furious, her sea-green eyes blazing 6 inches from his, and what she shouted at him, treading effortlessly in the killing cold, was not language, so much as a wave breaking. "You absolute, you suicidal. Do you know what this water does to your kind in an hour? Better than I did an hour ago," Dane said. His teeth were going like a hailstorm. His lips had stopped being his. Brooklyn looked at him, really looked, the fury cracking into horror as she catalogued what the sea had already taken. The gray lips, the wooden arms, the dangerous calm settling over him that every cold water creature knows, for the beginning of the end. And she said one word, in her own tongue, that was certainly a curse, took his ruined hand in her warm one, and dove, towing him with her, down into the lit dark. Before his body could understand enough to panic, pressure took his ears. Sea fires streamed past, and then up, through a fold in the black rock and air, they surfaced inside the earth. A sea cave, but the word was too small. The chamber rose black and vaulted away above the water, and the air in it was still and tasted of stone and salt, ancient air that had been breathed and rebreathed under the hill for 10,000 tides. Their breathing echoed. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped a slow clock. Brooklyn hauled him out onto a smooth stone shelf worn into a couch by centuries of bodies, and Dane lay shaking on it in the absolute blackness, hearing her move around the cave with sure, soundless familiarity, no fumbling, every reach finding its mark, and understood, through the fog of cold, where she had brought him, a refuge. One of theirs, the clan's, flint cracked. A little oil lamp caught, stone-bowled old beyond guessing, sitting in a niche where it had plainly sat for generations, and a light pushed the cave up around them, the shelf, the dark water, high dry ledges stacked with the modest treasure of a vanished people. 4-foot sealskins, gone stiff, net floats, a child's toy carved from whalebone, niches of stone jars. On the wall above the shelf, handprints in faded ochre, dozens deep, small and large, generations of palms pressed to the rock. "We were here, my family's," Brooklyn said, flat, not looking at him. She was pulling sealskins off the ledges, shaking decades out of them. One of the far refuges, grandmother's mother stalked it. "We had them up and down 200 miles of coast, never sleep twice in the same cove." She came back to him with her arms full. "Strip, skins and shared heat, or you die on my family's shelf, and you are not doing that." What followed was the least romantic and most intimate hour of Dane's life, stripped of every shred of alpha dignity, racked with shivering so violent it frightened them both, packed in stiff sealskins that smelled of a dead clan's care, with Brooklyn wrapped hard around him, doing the one thing wolves and sea-wolves had always had in common, burning, body to body, against the dark. She was furious the entire time. She scolded him through chattering lecture after lecture, hypothermia, cold shock, The arrogance of land alphas, her voice cracking on every third sentence, her arms never once loosening. And slowly, the cold gave him back, the shaking spaced out. Feeling returned to his hands and needles and in pain. Then his hands. The little lamp burned steadily. And there came a moment, he felt it arrive, when the silence between them changed, when warming became holding and both of them knew it, and neither moved, his heartbeat finding its way back under her ear, the drip of the cave keeping time. "You are the worst rescue I have ever performed," Dane said. His teeth still chattered at the edges. The laugh came through anyway, half broken. "I had to do it twice." He felt her go still against him. "You should not have come. You keep saying that." He turned his head. In the lamplight, her eyes were close and enormous, and bright with everything she was holding shut. "The bond disagrees." "I disagree. You are outvoted. The bond." She pulled back enough to see him, and the old war stood up in her face one more time, but tired now, fought out, gone threadbare at last in this stone room full of her dead. "Dane, be honest with me, here of all places. Look where you are. Look what loving me costs." Her hand swept the cave, the handprints, the stacked skins, the child's whalebone toy. "An entire people learned to live in holes in the sea because of what runs in my blood, and they are gone anyway. And you swam into winter water at night, alone, no boat, no light. You were dying when I reached you. Do you understand? 10 more minutes." Her voice tore. Above them, all through the cave, the air went tight, and the dark water of the pool shivered. "Everyone who keeps me gets the storm sooner or later. Everyone. The bond does not change the weather. It just ties you to the mast. Brooklyn. And I will not watch the sea take you the way it took Brooklyn." He took her face in his 2 hands, clumsy still, half-thawed, shaking, and she stopped. The cave was very quiet. The lamp flame stood straight. "9 days ago, I watched you walk into the sea, and I felt the bond go quiet, and I want you to know what that was like, because you think you know, and you do not. You think you spared me." His voice came out low and wrecked and absolutely level. "There is no weather you have. None. No gale, no lightning, nothing in your blood, or your grief or your worst day, that is worse than a silence. I have now lived both. I am qualified. The storm is you, alive and fighting. The calm was you, gone. Give me the storm, Brooklyn, every day, forever. I am begging you for bad weather." The lamp flame bent. "And as for cost," he was half laughing again, hopeless, his thumb moving on her cheekbone. "You keep tallying what loving you costs, and you have never once run the other column. 3 months. The mildest autumn in 300 years. A pup who howls your name at the door. A pack singing under lights you hung in the sky. Me finding my way through 10 miles of black water by the warmth of you alone. That is the ledger. That is the whole ledger. And you only ever read out the storms. You did the arithmetic like a hunter, love. Do it like a..." She kissed him. It was nothing like the bronze evenings, almost. There was no held breath in it, no question. It was a decision. 20 years of swim cold, swim empty, thrown down all at once. The grandmother's last order finally, gratefully disobeyed. And Dane felt the bond come fully alight between them like a struck match, the muffling torn away, the warmth flooding both directions at once, hers into him and his into her, 2 lamps in 1 window. She made a small, broken sound against his mouth. His hands were in her salt-stiff hair. The whole cave seemed to lean in around them, 10,000 tides of dark stone holding its breath, and the water began to glow. Neither of them saw it begin. The pool at the foot of the shelf kindled the way dawn kindles, a blue-white shimmer rising through the black water, brightening, spreading, every small sleeping life in the cave's hidden veins waking at once, and answering her, the way the small lives always had, the way the tide pools had answered. Her trailing fingers, but utterly, everywhere, all of it. Light came up out of the water and ran on the vaulted ceiling in slow silver ropes. It found the ochre handprints and set them flickering, generations of palms warming in the glow. It lit the child's whalebone toy, the folded skins, the stone jars, the whole patient horror of people who had loved each other in holes in the sea, lit all of it gently, blue and silver, like grief becoming something else. The sky answered her pain. It always had. The whole coast knew her sorrow by heart. This, the deep itself rising in light, was what her joy looked like in the world her people came from. And no one living had ever seen it before. They broke apart and saw the cave burning blue around them, and Brooklyn looked at the glowing water and the handprints shimmering, and then at Dane, and laughed, and the light surged with it, waves of brightness rolling through the pool like the cave itself laughing along. And then she was crying, which on her face looked almost the same, and for the first time in her whole hunted life, nothing rained. The light just got brighter. "Oh," Brooklyn said in a very small voice, watching her own joy fill her family's refuge, like floodwater made of moonlight. "Oh, it never did that. It never had the chance," Ain said. She pressed her forehead to his. Around him, the glow settled into a steady, patient shining, the cave keeping it the way coals keep heat, and the handprints of the maelstrom dead glimmered on the wall above the shelf where their last daughter lay tangled with a land wolf Alpha in the warm. "Mate," Brooklyn said, trying the rope on, finding it was not a rope at all. "Mate, Moon help you, Dane of the Tradewinds. You have no idea what you have just promised to weather." Dane gathered her in, watching the light of her happiness move on 10,000 years of stone, and spoke into her hair the entire and unimprovable truth. "Then I will get wet." They walked up the dune path into the village at mid-morning, hand in hand, and they did not have to say a word. A pack knows. That was the oldest truth of pack life, older than law, older than the hall. Some things cannot be hidden from wolves, and a completed bond is the first of them. Dane and Brooklyn came up the path salt-stained and sleepless, with the scent of each other settled into them past all disguising, and the village read them in a glance, in a breath. The woman hanging out washing, who went still with a sheet in her hands. The two young runners who stopped, dead. Then whooped. Old Garrick at his gate, who looked at his Alpha, and at the sea-wolf, and at their joined hands, and after a long moment, took his pipe from his mouth, and bowed his head to her, not to Dane, with the grave formality of the lowlands. The Alpha of the Tradewinds had taken a mate. The mate was the storm witch from the sea. By noon there was not a wolf on the coast who did not know. By dusk, Corvin had called for the assembly bell. He had to. Dane understood that even as the bell tolled the pack in through the winter dark, understood it with a cold clarity that had been growing in him since the cave. The old keeper had been fighting a patient war of inches, ledgers, and silences, a war designed to end with Brooklyn quietly gone, and nothing on the record but weather. A mating bond burned that strategy to the waterline. There is no quiet way to be rid of an Alpha's bonded mate. Mates cannot be voted out, escorted south, provisioned, and wished well. The pack law on it was absolute, and Corvin had taught it to every pup in the hall himself. The bond is the moon's law, above the council's. To move against her now, he would have to come into the open at last, and so he came, and Dane, who had spent 11 years watching this man be unfailingly, lethally measured, watched him overreach within the first minute. The hall was packed and silent, firelit, the pack still wearing the bruises of the longest night. Corvin rose from the elder's bench, and the dry, sorrowful, reasonable voice, the voice that had won the council fire by never asking for anything, asked for everything. "This bond cannot stand," Corvin said. "I call on this pack to declare it broken before the moon. The woman cast off our coast, and the Alpha, if he will not release her, set aside." The hall did not even gasp. It went past gasping, into the ringing stillness of 300 wolves who cannot believe what they have just heard. Set aside, deposed. The BLURB working the Tradewinds hall in 4 generations, and they had never in 300 years been spoken against a bonded pair. Even the fishermen, even the shut-faced men of the West Wall who would have cheerfully watched Brooklyn sail south forever, even they stared at the old keeper with something shifting behind their eyes, because there are doors a pack does not open, and the moon's law was the last of them. And stunned, quiet, A felt the strangest thing. The bond at his chest, bright, doubled, alive with Brooklyn's fear beside him, and underneath his own fury, almost lost in it, pity, because the request was mad, and Corvin was not mad, and so the request was something else. It was the act of a man who knows the bill has already been mailed, who hears the wagon on the coast road, who has perhaps 2 weeks to put the whole pack behind a locked door before what he summoned arrives, and who has just discovered that the door will not close with her inside. He is not fighting. Ustane thought with the chill of true sight. He is bailing water. He has been bailing water his whole life. On what law? Dane said aloud into the silence, very quietly. Keeper of the histories, cite it. On what law of this pack is a moon bond broken by a show of hands? And Corvin, the precise man, the man of pages and citations, the man who had never in 70 years misquoted so much as a fishing right, Corvin stood in the firelight with his thin hands gripping his stick, and cited nothing, and said instead, in a voice that cracked down the middle like old varnish, on the law that kept this pack alive, when the law you know was written on water. There are things older than the hall, Alpha. I am the only one left who, he stopped himself, too late. A whole hall full of wolves had heard the seam split, had seen for half a second, all the way down into something black and cold, and 200 years deep. The old man gathered himself visibly and overhand. The bond cannot stand, he repeated, barely above a whisper. It cannot. You have no idea what you have tied this pack to. Then tell them. The voice came from the back of the hall by the doors. Old Mara stood there with her lantern, snow melting on her shoulders, and her face, her seamed, sunken, seen everything face, was terrible. Not angry, finished. The face of a woman sitting down at last, a way carried so long, it had shaped her bones. Tell them, Corvin, Mara said, into the absolute hush. Or stand aside, and I will tell them the half I know, the half my grandmother whispered on her deathbed, and swore me silent on. Moon forgive me, because I was young and frightened, and the keeper's line said the silence kept us safe. She came up the aisle slowly, lantern swinging, 80 years old, and parting the packed wolves like a keel. I have watched you read your ledgers at this pack for 3 months, you dry old liar. Losses of the 9th week, always the near ledgers, always the new books. She stopped before the elder's bench and looked up at him, and her voice dropped something that carried to the rafters anyway. Read them, me old one. Read them the book with the lock on it, or give me the key before the moon, and I will. What broke in Corvin then Dane could never afterward describe, except that it was not dramatic. The old man did not crumple or cry out. He simply, slowly sat down on the elder's bench, like a wall subsiding, and stared at nothing, and was old. And when he spoke, the dry teacher's voice had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere small and far away and very tired. The key is on my neck, Corvin said. It has been on the keeper's neck for 200 years. I had hoped to die with it there. The ledger room received them like a held breath. Dane, Brooklyn, Mara, theaters, the heads of family, filing into the cool, dry dark behind the hall with lamps held high, and the deepest corner, the locked oak shelf, breathing out its faint, impossible smell of mildew into the tallow light, the smell of a thing shut away, wet that had never dried. The smell, Dane thought, his skin crawling, of the debt. Corvin's hands shook so badly on the iron lock that in the end it was Mara who turned the key. Inside, the books were older than every other book in the room, salt-stained, water-swollen along their spines, their covers stiff with the memory of damp. Corvin lifted out the oldest as if lifting a body, and laid it on the keeper's desk, and opened it, and the pages turned soft as cloth under his fingers, soft as something that had been rained on and dried and rained on again, 200 years ago, in the hands of men who rode outdoors. Shore in weather, it was a pack roll. The founding roll of the Tradewinds. Dane knew the form of it. The same census was taken to this day. Every family head's name entered in the keeper's hand at each turning of the year. The first pages held the names of the founding generation, the wolves of the crossing, the ancestors whose names every pup learned in this very room. There was Dane's own line, 5th entry on the page, Hail, of the North Cliff, but the roll was written in 2 columns, and the second column, name after name, after name, a full third of the founding pack, had been struck through. not erased, not torn out, struck, each name cancelled with a single deliberate line of ink, the strokes still angry after 2 centuries. And beside the cancelled column at its head, where the first column was headed landholding, a single word stood in faded ink, in a script gone brown as old blood, tide-bound. The room was so quiet that Dane could hear the candles burning. Brooklyn stepped past him to the desk. She put her fingers on the page, on the struck-through names, the way she had trailed them through the tide pool, and Dane half expected the old ink to kindle at her touch. She read down the cancelled column slowly, name by name, her lips moving, and partway down she stopped breathing, and her finger stopped on a name, and Dane, reading over her shoulder, felt the floor of the world tilt. He could not read the old spelling. He did not need to. He had heard the name sung on a stone beach, in a dead tongue, on the longest night of the autumn, the name of the line of the first mother, the line the blood gift ran down. Her line, here on the founding roll of his own pack, in his own pack's archive, under his own ancestors' names, struck through. The stories, Mara said softly, behind them, to the stunned lamplit room. The wolves who could shift beneath the water. Every grandmother on this coast has told them for 200 years. Did none of you ever wonder why we tell them sad stories? Her old voice shook. They are not warnings, children. They never were warnings. They are the only apology we dared to make. And Corvin, sitting collapsed in the keeper's chair with the lamplight in the seams of his face, told it, flat, precise, dates and headings, the keeper keeping to the very last. The Tradewinds had not come to this coast as land wolves. They had come as one people, land-born and tide-bound together, one pack of 2 natures, fleeing the same hunters' war that burned the old country, and the tide-bound had carried the land-born across the worst of the crossing, towed the rafts, dived the wrecks, fed the pups on what the deep provided. They reached this coast together. They founded together. The first winter's census was taken in 2 columns, because the pack lived in 2 elements, and the columns were written as equals. And then the men with the instruments found the coast, Corvin said, 11 years after the founding. They did not find it by chance. His eyes went to Brooklyn, and there was no malice left in them at all, only the bottom of something, finally reached. The gift ran in the tide-bound lines then as it runs now. A grief here, storm there, anomalies, gathering on the charts of patient men, 11 years of arithmetic, and one autumn the keeper of that day, my grandfather's grandfather, stood where I stand and read the pattern, and put a choice to the founding council in this room, at that desk, by candlelight. Weather follows the tide-bound. The hunters follow the weather. The pack cannot outswim what swims, and cannot outrun what it carries, so it would carry it no more. The vote of the founding council was in the book. It was 4 lines long. The landholding families would move inland and it'd become in every record, every story, every law, a land pack, and the tide-bound would be struck from the roll, barred from the territory, and put back to sea in the dead of one moonless autumn night, with what they could carry in diving sacks. So that the arithmetic, when the men with instruments completed it, would find a shore of ordinary wolves, and a cold, empty sea. They sang, Corvin said. That is in the book too. The keeper of that day wrote it in the margin, the only margin note in the whole roll, and his hand, you can see where his hand failed him. He did not look at the page. He had no need. Dane understood that the old man had been reading that margin his entire life, in a locked room by candlelight, alone. The tide-bound did not fight, and did not curse us. They stood in the surf with their pups on their backs, the whole struck column of them, and they sang the parting lament to the warm fires of their brothers. And the land-born stood behind barred doors and listened, and let them go into the winter sea, and survived. His voice ended. The candles burned. The mildew smell of the old wet book hung in the dry room like the ghost of an ocean. Brooklyn stood at the desk with her fingers still resting on her family's cancelled name, and when she finally spoke, her voice was the flat, sanded, survivor's voice from the tide pools, but underneath it now, far down, Dane could hear the pressure of the whole sea. You did not lose the sea wolves, she said. You left us. We survived. It came out of Corvin like water out of a wrung cloth, the bottom of the bottom, the bare bedrock of his line. his office, his life, 200 years of locked doors speaking at last through one exhausted old man. That is what the land was, girl. Survival. Do not you stand in this room in your dead clan's skin and tell me my fathers chose it gladly. I have read the margin. I have read it 10,000 times. But your kind felt too much, and the sea answered every feeling, every grief a beacon, every joy a flare. There was no hiding beside you. There was never any hiding beside you. His pale eyes came up to hers, wet, ancient, asking for nothing. We would have drowned with you, and so we drowned without you, he said slowly on dry land for 200 years. And called it the weather, and told it to the pups as stories, and locked the smell of it in a shelf. And I am the last wolf alive who knew it true, and when you washed up on our sand, child of the struck column, with the sky on a string and at Alpha falling towards you like a tide, I did not see a girl. The old man's face worked once terribly. I saw the bill, come due, with 200 years of interest, and I did what my line has always done. May the moon spit me back. The room had stopped breathing some time ago. It was Dane who heard it first, Keeper's words. My line is always done, and felt the cold come up through the floor of him, the wrongness of 3 months finally crawling into the light where he could see its shape. The letter, the arithmetic, the address was kept dust-free for 200 years. Corvin, his own voice sounded far away to him. What did you do? The old man looked at his Alpha, and Brooklyn, at the bond between them, bright and doubled and visible to any wolf with eyes. And Elder Corvin, keeper of the histories of the Tradewinds, bowed his white head over his grandfather's ledger and told them what was coming up the coast. They had 9 days to make ready, by Corvin's arithmetic, and the arithmetic of the keeper's line had never once been wrong. The pack used all 9. Afterward, the old wolves would say those 9 days made the Tradewinds more than the battle did, because the whole pack knew now. Mara had seen to it that the telling went to every hearth, the struck column, the parting lament, the 200 years of weather that had been grief all along, and a strange thing happened in the wake of the truth. The fishermen of the West Wall, the shut-faced men who had wanted Brooklyn gone since the first night, they took it hardest and perned hardest. It was their grandmothers' voices in the sad stories. It was their bloodline's doors that had been barred against the singing. Garrick of the Lowlands stood up at the war council with his pipe dead in his fist and said that his line had owed a debt for 200 years and that he, for one, did not intend to die still owing it, and the Lowlands stamped and growled assent, and that was the end of the 2 packs under one. So, they would stand, all of them. That was the decision, chapter and verse of pack law never had to be invoked for, the decision that made itself the moment the truth finished traveling. The hunters were coming up the coast for the last daughter of the wolves. The Tradewinds had abandoned, and this time, the doors would not be barred. Brooklyn spent the 9 days learning to do the one thing she had never in her life dared, feel on purpose. Every teacher I ever had taught me numbness, she told Dane. The second night, the 2 of them out on the dark headland, where her practice could not frighten the village. Swim cold, swim empty. 20 years of learning not to. There is no one alive who can teach me to. She looked at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. I am going to have to teach myself aiming, in 9 days, with the lives of 300 wolves on the table. You will not be alone while you do it, Dane said. That is the difference. That is the whole difference. None of the others who had the gift, your great-grandmother, the fog whistler, any of them, none of them ever trained with the bond. And that was the discovery of the 9 days, the thing no tidebound teacher could have taught her, because no tidebound bearer of the gift had ever stood beside a bonded mate and tried. The bond was ballast. Her whole life, every feeling had run straight through her into the sky, a lightning rod in reverse, nothing between her heart and the weather. Now there was something between, a second keel, a warm fixed point that her storms could lean against, and Dane learned to stand inside her practice gales with his feet planted, and the bond burning steady, an anchor a hurricane could circle, while Brooklyn stood at the cliff's edge and felt, deliberately, precisely, one brief at a time, fear at a time, and watched the sky obey. By the 7th day she could call wind out of stillness and put it back. By the 8th, she could braid. That was her own word for it. And the first time Dane saw it done, he understood why the old clans had spoken of the gift in the language of bargains. Grief alone made rain. Rage alone made lightning. Fear alone made wind. But a heart does not feel one thing at a time. No heart ever has. And Brooklyn had spent 20 years terrified of her own mingled feelings, flattening them to nothing before they could blend. Now, on the dark headland, she stopped flattening. She stood at the cliff's edge and let herself feel everything at once, on purpose, each strand held separate and deliberate in the way that only a person who has catalogued her feelings, like an enemy all her life, could ever hold them. Grief for her clan, braided to rage for the abandonment, braided to fear for the pack sleeping behind her, and the sky over the headland became a single vast instrument, wind and rain and walking fire moving together, conducted. On the 9th day, at dusk, the South Watch fired the flare. They came in force this time. Not one boat of patient men with instruments, a flotilla, dark hulls running without lights up the winter coast, and through Mara's old spyglass. Dane counted them from the cliff, and felt the count land in his stomach. 11 boats. 200 years of arithmetic had concluded in some warm office far away that the anomaly at Tradewinds Point was the find of 10 generations, the proof their trade had hunted since the founding crime, and they had emptied the ledgers and come to collect everything. They will stand off the harbor mouth, Corvin said quietly, beside him on the dark cliff. The old man had not been put under guard. He had asked to be formally before the War Council, and the Council had refused, on Garrick's motion, in 5 words that were their own kind of sentence. He goes where his alpha goes. So he stood at his alpha's shoulder in the wind, wrapped in gray, the keeper's spyglass shaking slightly in his hands, looking at the thing his letter had summoned. They will want her taken on the water or pinned on the shore. They have read 200 years of weather data, Alpha. They know what she is. They know fear drives the wind, and they will try to make her afraid, because a terrified gift is a blind one. That is how they took the clans. Every time, panic the beacon, follow the flare. His voice was dust. Do not let them frighten her. Dane looked down the dark cliff line to the headland point above the harbor mouth. Frighten her, he said. She's been frightened her whole life, keeper. Tonight she's something else. Brooklyn stood alone on the point, at the very edge, where the cliff dropped sheer to the breaking sea, and she had shifted. The silver-blue wolf faced the incoming boats, the last light dying behind her, fur running like moonlit water in the rising wind, and her eyes, even from a quarter-mile down the cliff line, Dane could see her eyes, twin points of sea-green fire in the dusk. She was not flattening anything. Tonight, the hunters' lead boats crossed the harbor line, and Brooklyn opened her heart all the way for the first time in her life, and the Tradewinds learned what the sky had been waiting 20 years to say. The storm did not gather. It arrived, vertically, out of a clear violet dusk, a cyclone of black cloud unwinding above the headland point, like something uncoiling from the deep of the sky, and the first lightning came down, not as a bolt, but as a fence. That was the only word the survivors ever found for it. Lightning walked down the cliff line, stroke, 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 a dozen strikes in perfect sequence, north to south, a burning palisade slamming into the rock between the sea and the packlands, and the air all along the cliffs went sharp with ozone, copper and static on every tongue, every wolf's fur lifting, the whole night smelling like a struck flint, the size of the world. On the point, rain had begun to fall around Brooklyn, and it was falling upward, rising off her fur in silver threads, torn skyward by the column of wind she stood at the heart of, a wolf burning blue-white at the foot of her own connected sky. And below, in the harbor mouth, the sea took sides. Boats never landed in order. The wind met them at the harbor line like a hand that palmed them away, not a gale's blind shoving, but precise, contemptuous, a sheepdog's work, this one driven onto the bar, that one spun beam on to the swells. 2 more slammed grinding together, and the swells themselves rose against the hulls in deliberate ranks. The men who got ashore wet, scattered, half-deafened, their formation broken on the rocks the storm had chosen for them, and the pack came down on them out of the thunder. This was the thing the old songs were made from afterward, the thing the pups of that night told their own pups 50 years on. The Tradewinds fought inside her storm, and the storm fought with them. Dane led the first rush down the cliff stairs with the lightning fence crashing rhythm overhead, and the rhythm was theirs. The strikes fell in the gaps between the pack's surges, lighting the ground white for the wolves' eyes in the instant before each charge, blinding the invaders in the instant. Wind that flattened the hunter's aim parted around running wolves like a curtain. Wolf packs wheeled through the chaos and formations the wind itself bent to shield, and the thunder rolled in time with the drum of paws on wet stone. And 300 years from now, Dane thought, in the white flash and the howling, they will still be singing this, the night, the storm, and the wolves moved as one animal, for the first time in 100 years, the night the Tradewinds remembered what they had been. He fought his way along the harbor front through frames of lightning, and the bond burned at his chest like a sun, her fury, her grief, her terror for him, all of it braided, all of it aimed, all of it his, to lean on as it leaned on him, and on the point above, through all of it, Brooklyn conducted, and to not let one single strike fall on living flesh. That was her line, drawn on the first of the 9 days, stated once, and never argued. I have a body count. It stays where it is. So the lightning fenced and herded and blinded but did not kill. The sea swamped and scattered but rolled men ashore alive, and the hunters of the patient trade, who had 200 years of data on terrified prey, and not one page on a gift that aimed, broke against a violence that refused to murder. Them men could not be fought. It began boat by boat and man by man to run. It was nearly over when the flare went up from the rocks south of the harbor. One last boat, one last crew, working along the shore where the cliff path came down. Where are the non-combatants sheltered in the old boathouse, where a small, fearless, half-feral pup, who had escaped his minders in the chaos, because the Silver Lady was on the cliff, and she was his, and he wanted to see, stood alone in the open on the shingle, in the lightning light. Dane was 300 yards away, and saw it in frames. Briar, white-lit, frozen, the hunter rising from the rocks between the pup and the boathouse, a dark shape with a leveled gun, shouting to his crew, a hostage, a shield, the oldest move of cornered men. The gap closing, too far, the bond screaming as Brooklyn saw it, to the whole storm faltering above the harbor, as her discipline cracked toward panic. A gray shape, thin and wrapped and running badly, running like 80 years and a stick left behind on the rocks, running like a man spending the whole of something hoarded, crossing the open shingle in the white light, faster than anyone who knew him would have sworn he could move. Corvin reached the pup 2 strides ahead of the hunter and did not fight. He was a historian, a fighter, and he knew it, and he did the one thing his whole long bookkeeping life it fitted him to do. He got between and balanced the ledger. The shot and the thunder came together. Dane never heard which was first. What the pack saw in the frames of lightning was the old keeper folding down over the boy, taking the knight's one bullet in the back of the shoulder, wrapping Briar under the gray cloak with both arms, while the hunter closed in. And then the sky, which had not killed all night, came down the shingle like the wrath of 200 years. The wind took the hunter off his feet and put him into the sea. The wave that received him carried him, choking and alive. Her line held, even then, even for him, 100 yards out, and threw him across his own retreating boat, like a thing spat out. And the lightning fence walked one final time, slamming down around the old man and the pup in a perfect blinding ring, a palisade of fire with the 2 of them at its center, untouchable, while the last boats of the patient trade clawed away from Tradewinds Point into the dark, carrying away men who would spend the rest of their lives explaining what their instruments could not have measured. Silence then, a ringing, enormous silence after. The storm unwound from the headland slowly, gracefully, drawn back up into a clearing sky like breath let go, and the rain fell, ordinary and gentle for a moment, over the wreckage and the steam, and stopped. Wolves stood and shifted and counted each other in the dark, shouting names, finding every name answered, bruised, burned, bleeding, all of it the mendable kind, not one wolf lost, not one hunter dead, a battle out of no ledger ever kept. On the shingle, in the fading ozone reek, Dane reached the ring of fused and smoking stone and found Corvin sitting up against a rock with briar gathered in his cloak, the pup outraged, soaked, entirely unharmed, and already telling the story, and the old man's blood running black in the starlight from his ruined shoulder, his face white as the founding rolls pages, his eyes calm in a way Dane had never once seen them in 11 years. "Tell Hale," Corvin said faintly. "The wound is honest work. He will know the rate." And then looking up past Dane, his old face working, "It did not kill them. 200 years of arithmetic, and it spared even the man who—" He stopped, started again, barely a whisper. "We could have stayed, could not we, all those years ago? We could have stood like this, together, and it would have been enough. It was never the gift that doomed anyone. It was the leaving." Dane crouched, backing his own torn shirt against the old man's shoulder, and made no answer, because there was not one, and because above them on the cliff, a shape was coming down the stairs through the settling night. Brooklyn walked out across the shingle, human again, barefoot on the wet stones, soaked silver in the starlight, swaying with a tiredness past anything bone deep, and around her the air still crackled faintly, static lifting wisps of her hair, the sky's last connection draining slowly out of her like tide out of a pool. She looked at Briar, alive and loud, at Corvin, bleeding and breathing, at her mate, kneeling in the wreckage of the patient trade's 200-year hunt. Dane rose. Around them, the pack was gathering at the edges of the lightning ring, 300 wolves, to steaming dark, staring at her, and not one face in all of it wore the look she had spent her life fleeing, the look from the longest night, the look from every coast. They looked at her, the way the small lives in the tide pool had, like filings, finding north. "Still think you are the storm?" Dane said. He was grinning, filthy, bleeding from the forehead, a light. Brooklyn stopped before him on the wet shingle. Behind her, far out over the sea, the last of it discharged, one final sheet of lightning splitting the horizon from end to end, silent with distance, throwing her silhouette against the whole sky for the length of a heartbeat. "No," she said, "I am the one holding its leash." And then her knees gave, and the Alpha of the Tradewinds caught his Luna before she touched the stones, and over his shoulder to the 300, in a voice the old wolves said afterward had thunder still living in it, "The Tradewinds stand. Carry the keeper to Hales, alight the fires. All our family is home." Spring came to Tradewinds Point the way it had never come before, early and gentle, and on purpose. The pack rebuilt through the tail of that winter under the mildest skies the coast had ever recorded, and nobody called it luck anymore. The fishermen read the Luna's weather the way they would once read the barometer glass, and said so out loud, grinning, in the boat sheds. "Fine spell coming. The silver ladies in good spirits." Roofs went up over the longest night's scars. The great fallen oak was milled, and its timber, by a vote of the whole pack, proposed from the lowlands, went to build the first new thing the Tradewinds had raised in 200 years, a boathouse on the southern shore, below Brooklyn's cottage, with wide doors facing the open water, at a deep launching ramp, and over the lintel, carved by Garrick's own hand in letters copied carefully from the founding roll, tide-bound. The judgment of Elder Corvin was held in the pack hall on the first day of fall spring, before the whole pack, as law required. He came to it on his feet, barely. Hale had saved the arm but not the strength of it, and he came carrying the keeper's key on its cord, and he stood in the judgment circle where Brooklyn had once stood, dripping, and he refused, formally, the right to speak in his own defense. "The record speaks," was all he said. "I kept it. Let it keep me." The arguments went on for a day, and they were the pack, growing up in public. Some wolves wanted exile and said so with heat. He had written the letter. The longest night was his, every scar on every roof traced back to his sealed wax. And there were wolves, more than Dane expected, who stood up for the unbearable other column, that the old man had also been the only soul carrying a 200-year-old weight the whole pack had buried and forgotten, that he would carried it alone, as a boy handed a key and a curse together, that he had confessed when silence would have saved him, and stood his watch on the cliff through the battle, and put his old body between a bullet and a pup of the bloodline that had wronged the girl in the first place. It was the Luna who ended it. Brooklyn had sat silent through the whole day's arguing. She had standing to demand his hide, and every wolf in the hall knew it, and her silence had hung over the proceedings like weather. When she finally rose, the hall went so quiet the fire could be heard, and she crossed to the judgment circle and stood before the old man who had summoned her family's destroyers down on her twice. My grandmother had a saying, she said, "The sea does not forgive. It just decides you are not worth drowning." She studied him, the white head, the dead arm, the key. "I am not the sea. I was just raised by it. So here is what I want, keeper, and I want it instead of exile. And it is worse, and you know it is worse. Live, stay. Keep the histories, all of them, the locked shelf in the open with the rest, and teach. Every pup in this pack learns the old roll from your mouth. Names, lament, margin, and all. Every year, as long as you last." Her voice never rose. "You spent your life making sure the stories stayed children's tales. Spend what is left making sure they never become tales again. That is my judgment. If my mate and his council will have it." They had it. The vote was called and carried in the hush, and Corvin bowed his white head to the Luna of the Tradewinds, and that was the first time the title was ever spoken aloud, there in the judgment circle, by old Mera of all voices, calling the count. "The Luna's mercy carries. Let the record show it." Word went through the hall like the tide coming in, and the pack rose, and the sound they made shook 200 years of dust out of the rafters. The formal naming came at the first full moon of true spring, and the Tradewinds did a thing no living wolf had seen. They held it on the beach. Not at the hall, not on the headland. On the shore, at the meeting line of the two elements, with the whole pack standing where the wet sand met the dry, and Brooklyn was named Luna of the Tradewinds wolves. At the water's edge in the moonlight, the first tide-bound Luna since the struck column, with the surf running up around her big feet like something that wanted to be at the ceremony too. Mera spoke the old words, Dane spoke the new ones, and when the pack howled her name to the moon, 300 voices on the shoreline, the sea lay down flat and bright from the beach to the edge of the world, and held the moon's reflection up to her like a gift, her own glass calm, 10 miles of it, joy made visible, and this time every wolf on the stand knew exactly what they were looking at, and what it meant, and nobody was afraid. And then summer came, and the pups learned to swim. That was the season Dane held on to afterward, in his memory, as the true ending of the whole story, not the battle, not the naming, but the long gold afternoons. On the southern shore, when the Luna of the Tradewinds taught the pack's pups the sea, they came down the dune path in shrieking mobs. They learned the breaker line, the third bar, the politeness. You cannot beat it. You can only be polite to it, recited now by 7-year-olds with great solemnity. The bravest of them learned to open their eyes in the blue hush and hang there, listening to the muffled boom of the waves overhead, the heartbeat of the other country. Their own great-great-grandmothers had been born too, and first among them, always, in the water before breakfast, and dragged from it. At Wattpad, 6 years old now, utterly fearless, the thin white scar over his ear worn like a medal, who had announced to the whole pack at the naming feast that when he grew up he was going to be tide-bound, and had been only slightly deflated to learn it did not work that way, and had decided to do it anyway, out of pure stubbornness. He swam like a dropped stone for 1 whole month, then like a dog. Then, by midsummer, like something that made Brooklyn go very quiet the first time she saw it, smooth and fluent and not afraid, out past the breakers, in the deep gold light. "He will never have the gift," she said to Dane, watching the boy porpoise through the swells with 3 other pups in his wake, or the paws. "But look at him. Look at them." Her voice did something complicated. 200 years, Dane. It only took one to come back. The seal that hauled out on her beach to stare at her had brought, that summer, 2 others. She still considered it rude. The night it happened was an evening in late summer, and they were on the stone beach below the cottage, the Luna and her Alpha, alone in the warm dark, sitting where they would sat the night she told him where she came from. Salt was drying on their skin from an evening swim. The stones still held the day's sun, warm under their hands. Up the coast, faint, the village fires. Out front, the dark breathing water. And far off to the south, over to the open sea, a storm, a real one, a wild one. They could see it coming for an hour. A vast, slow tower of cloud walking up the coast with lightning working inside it like a heartbeat, the kind of widowmaker that had opened this whole story, the kind that had once sent every wolf on the point to bar the shutters. Nobody on Tradewinds. Land moved from their fires. Dane felt Brooklyn watching it come, and felt what was in her as it came. The bond carried it, clear as written words, no fear at all. Interest, kinship, even one weather-maker's professional regard for another. Storm came on up the coastline, magnificent and indifferent, and reached the southern line of Tradewinds water, and parted. There was no drama in it. That was the wonder of it. The great cloud tower simply divided around the point, the way a river divides around a standing stone, half walking out to sea, half sliding along the inland hills, the lightning flickering courteously past on either side, the rain falling in silver curtains to the north and the south of the pack, and if not one drop on them. And overhead in the gap, the stars came through, and the moon, and the whole territory lay in a corridor of calm, like a held breath that had finally, after 200 years, been let out as a sigh. Because the Luna of the Tradewinds was happy. And the sky knew it. The sky had always known everything about her. That had been the curse, her whole hunted life, every grief a beacon, every fear a flare. Nobody had ever told her the same sky would broadcast her joy, that peace, too, could be weather, that a contented heart on a safe shore could stand over a whole pack like a roof. Dane lay back on the warm stones and watched the storm walk politely around his entire territory, and started laughing, and could not stop. "What?" Brooklyn said. "The fishermen are going to be insufferable. They will stop hauling their boats entirely. They will plan voyages around your moods. Garrick will want a schedule. He already asked Mara to ask me," she admitted. And then they were both laughing, sprawled on the stones of the beach where she had drowned and come back, under the divided sky, while the thunder grumbled away harmlessly on either hand, like an old argument losing interest in itself. The laughter wound down into the good silence. The storm passed. The sea settled into her glass, joy calm, shining faintly, holding the stars, and Brooklyn sat up after a while and went still, looking out at the water, and trailed her fingers in the tide pool at her side, absently, an old habit. The pool kindled blue-white around her fingers, the small lives answering. They always did, and far out on the dark horizon, so far it could have been a star setting, except that stars set white and this was blue, and stars sink and this rose. A light answered back. It glimmered low on the water at the edge of the world, blue-white, faint, and it pulsed, once, twice. Slow, patient rhythm, like a lamp being shuttered and opened, like sea fire streaming off something large moving just under the surface, a long way off, coming on. Brooklyn rose to her feet without knowing she would die. Her fingers were still trailing light. Out on the horizon, the answer pulsed again, and then, beside it, fainter, a second, Dane. Her voice was barely there. "I see them. Nothing natural makes that light. Nothing." Her hand had found his, and was gripping it hard enough to hurt. The bond was roaring with her, not fear. He knew her fear, and this was not it. This was something that had no name, because she had never once in 20 years been allowed to feel it. Out on the dark water, the twin glimmers rose and dipped with a long swell, steady, patient, unmistakably approaching, and overhead the night stayed clear, and the sea stayed glass, because what was cresting in the Luna's heart was not terror. It was the lament, running backward. "The deep keeps faith," Brooklyn whispered. The old words, the grandmother's words, remade. The tide keeps faith. Dane, the men with the instruments, they never found bodies. I was 12. I never saw. I only forever assumed. What if some of them? What if all is calm? All this joy on the water all summer? What if it carried? She stopped. She started again, steadier. watching the lights come on across the dark like the first two lamps of a returning fleet. I spent 20 years swimming silently so nothing could find me. What if I just spent a summer shining, and something did? They stood together on the stone beach, the Alpha and the Luna of the Tradewinds, watching the sea bring in whatever the sea was bringing, and behind them on the cliff the village fires burned, and the doors of the point stood open. Everyone, and Brooklyn laughed. One note, wet and disbelieving. And wiped her eyes, and not one drop of rain fell anywhere in the world. You know the stories were true all along, she said. Which part? She did not look away from the horizon, from the blue lights rising and dipping, coming up the long dark water toward the shore. The lament had been sung to, 200 years late, and not too late after all. All of it, Brooklyn said. That is the part no one tells the pups. The stories not end when you stop being afraid of them. The sea lay calm all the way to the edge of the world, and the tide came in. That is the end of this tale. But in the world of the supernatural, there is always another shadow waiting. Thank you for staying with me through every twist, turn, and heartbeat. If you enjoyed the ride, there is more waiting for you. Take a look at the other audiobooks on this channel. Do not forget to subscribe if you want more magic, monsters, and stories that go bump in the night. Until next time, stay curious and brave, and for listening.